Chapter 1. Issei Hyoudou had been told, more than once, that the basement beneath the old school building was the safest place in Ko. Warded stone. Layered barriers. A summoning circle old enough that Rias herself called it inherited rather than built. He believed it, the way he believed most things Rias told him, without asking why a place needed to be this safe in the first place. He found out why on a Tuesday night in early spring, when the air in the room turned cold enough to fog his breath even though the brazier in the corner was still burning. Rias stood at the center of the circle in her full club uniform, the crimson of her hair the only warm color in the room. Aquino was beside her, sleeves rolled, hands folded in front of her in the posture she used when she was nervous and trying not to show it. Kiba stood near the door, arms crossed, jaw tight. Kaneko sat on the stone steps with her knees drawn up, not looking at anyone. And Grayfia, who almost never came to Ko without an appointment, stood just outside the circle's edge, silver hair catching the brazier light, her expression unreadable in the particular way that meant she had already decided something and was waiting for the room to catch up. "You wanted to see me," Issei said. He tried for casual, and only half made it. "We did." Rias's voice was steady, the voice she used when she had rehearsed something and didn't want it to show. "Issei, I need you to trust me tonight. More than you ever have." "You say that like I have a choice." "You do," Grayfia said before Rias could answer. "That is precisely the problem we are here to discuss." Issei looked between them. Aquino wouldn't meet his eyes. Kiba's hand had drifted, almost unconsciously, toward the hilt at his hip, not drawing, just resting there, a habit of readiness that told Issei more than any of their faces did. "Somebody explain it to me like I'm slow," he said. "Because right now I feel pretty slow." Rias exhaled. When she spoke again, the rehearsed steadiness cracked at the edges. 2 weeks ago, the Citri family detected a fluctuation in your sacred gear that shouldn't exist. Not boosted gear instability. Something underneath it. Grayfia confirmed it independently 3 days later. She paused. "There is a second signature inside you, Issei. Dormant. We don't fully understand what it is. But it is old, and it is powerful, and twice in the last month it has begun to stir on its own, without your knowledge, without your control." "That's not possible," Issei said automatically, and then thought of the headaches. The nights he'd woken with his hand pressed flat against his own chest like he was holding something in. He told himself it was stress. He hadn't told anyone. Grayfia watched his face change and seemed to read the truth on it. "You have felt it," she said. "It wasn't a question. Maybe. A little. I didn't think it was anything. It is not nothing." Rias's hands had curled into fists at her sides. "Issei, if this signature destabilizes without containment, it could kill you. It could kill everyone in this room. We don't know its nature, only its scale, and its scale terrifies people who do not frighten easily." She looked briefly at Grayfia, who did not deny it. "There is a method. A modification to the evil peace system, something Sirzechs and Ajuka developed years ago for exactly this kind of catastrophic risk, a containment reincarnation, layered directly over whatever this is, to suppress it before it can fully wake. It has never been used on a living subject. We would be the first." "You want to reincarnate me again," Issei said slowly. "Over the top of what I already am." "We want to save your life," Rias said, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way that was not rehearsed at all. "I am not doing this to control you. I would never. But if I do nothing and that thing wakes up and tears you apart from the inside, then my caution will have killed you instead, and I will not, let that happen while there is something I can do." Issei looked at her for a long moment. He believed her. That was the worst part, somehow, that he could see in her face she meant every word, that this was not betrayal dressed as concern but concern that had curdled, somewhere along the way, into something that looked enough like betrayal to taste the same going down. "And if I say no?" "Then I respect that," Rias said. "And I pray every day that I'm not burying you within the year." Kaneko's voice came small from the steps. "Issei. Please." She didn't look up. "I don't want to lose anyone else." It was that, more than anything Rias or Grayfia said, that finally moved him. He thought of the year and a half he'd spent with these people. The fights they'd survived. The ridiculous, ordinary mornings where Kaneko stole the good cereal and Kiba burned toast and Akino laughed at both of them with a cruelty that was really just affection wearing a mask. He thought he knew, with the specific certainty of someone who has decided not to examine a thing too closely, that whatever was sleeping inside him could not possibly be worse than the people who loved him being afraid. He was wrong. He simply did not know it yet. Okay, he said. Do it. Rias's shoulders dropped half an inch, relief and grief arriving together. Grayfia stepped into the circle without ceremony and produced, from somewhere within her uniform, a small case of black lacquered wood. Inside, resting on dark velvet, was a single piece. A king, but wrong. The crimson of its crystal interior shot through with veins of something colorless, something that did not catch the brazier light so much as swallow it. This will feel different from a standard reincarnation, Grayfia said, addressing Issei directly now, her voice gentler than he had ever heard it. It is designed to reach further. To find the deepest layer of what you are and lay our authority over it like a second skin. There may be pain. There may be resistance. We do not fully know what we are containing, only that it must be contained. Great pep talk, Issei said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Let's get it over with. He knelt at the center of the circle, the way he had the first time, the way that should have felt routine by now and instead felt like standing at the edge of something with no bottom he could see. Rias took the piece from Grayfia's case with hands that were, for the first time he could remember, not quite steady. Rias Gremory, she began, and the circle beneath Issei's knees began to glow. By the authority vested in my house and the binding of my blood, do reincarnate this servant. The piece touched his chest. For 1/2 of 1 second, nothing happened, and Issei thought, with the particular relief of someone bracing for pain that doesn't come, that maybe it would be fine after all. Then the second signature woke up. It did not wake slowly. It did not wake like something startled from sleep. It woke like a door being kicked off its hinges, like a tide that had spent an eternity gathering itself finally arriving all at once, and Issei's entire body convulsed as something vast and ancient and utterly, fundamentally other rose up from a place inside him that had no name in any language the living still spoke. The modified piece, designed to reach down and lay a leash over whatever it found something that had never once in its existence known what it meant to wear one. It rejected the leash the way a sun rejects the cold. The Crystal King did not crack. It did not shatter the way pieces sometimes did when a vessel proved incompatible. It detonated, a concentrated pulse of crimson-white light that threw Rias backward into Akino, sent Kiba's sword spinning out of its sheath without him drawing it, and knocked Grayfia Lucifuge, the strongest queen, 3 full steps back with her arms raised against a force she had not expected to need defending from. Issei screamed. It was not a sound born of pain alone, though there was pain, a white-hot unraveling of every nerve in his body as the king's compulsion was torn out by the root. It was the sound of something that had been silent for longer than the underworld itself had existed, finding, for the first time, a throat to scream through. Black wings tore out of his back first, 6 of them, vast and feathered in a darkness so complete it seemed to drink the brazier's light rather than merely absorb it. Then, between and beneath them, 6 more unfolded, white as old bone, radiant in a way that had nothing gentle in it, light the way a blade is light, the way judgment is light. 12 wings in total, dark and pale interwoven, beating once and stirring dust off the ancient stones that had not moved in centuries. The summoning circle beneath him cracked from the inside out. Not from his weight, not from any force he was consciously exerting, but because the seal etched into that stone, the inherited, careful, centuries-old containment ward that Rias had called the safest place in Ko, recognized what was rising within it, and found itself entirely, hopelessly inadequate. Above Issei's bowed head, where the broken crystal of the king's piece still hung suspended in the unraveling light, a crown took shape that was not metal and was not light, a circlet of dark iron veined with the same colorless brilliance that had shot through the corrupted piece, resting itself without ceremony or permission upon his brow. Rias, pushing herself up off the floor with Akino's help, stared at the kneeling figure at the center of the ruined circle and felt something in her chest go very cold and very still. Issei, she said. Her voice did not sound like her own. He raised his head. His eyes, which had been a perfectly ordinary brown for as long as she had known him, were not brown any longer. They held a depth to them now, a weight, the kind of ancient and terrible patience that belonged to something far older than 18 years. "I remember," he said, and his voice carried an undertone now that made the stones themselves seem to listen. "I remember all of it." Grayfia, who had not moved, who stood with one hand still half raised in a guard she had not lowered, found herself looking at the awakened figure before her and feeling, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, something close to fear. "That is not possible," she said softly. "The bloodline ended. We watched it end." "It didn't end," Issei said. Or the thing wearing Issei's voice said, though it was still, unmistakably, unbearably him. "It slept. And you just woke it up trying to put it on a leash." The 12 wings settled, slow and heavy, around his shoulders like a cloak he had been waiting 18 years to put on. "I am sorry, Rias," he said, and there was real grief in it, his grief, Issei's grief, even as the rest of him stood in a posture no 18-year-old boy from the human world had ever worn. "I know you meant it kindly. I know you were trying to save me." He rose to his feet, and the cracked stone beneath him seemed to bow rather than break further, settling into new lines as though accommodating a weight it had always, somehow, been built to bear. "But I am not who you have been protecting. I never fully was. And what's awake in me now does not answer to a peace. Not yours. Not anyone's." "Issei, please," Rias said, stepping forward despite Akino's hand on her arm, despite every instinct that should have told her to be afraid. "Whatever this is, we can work through it together, we don't have to." "Lucifer," Grayfia said. The word landed in the room like a struck bell. Everyone turned to her. Her face had gone the color of old paper, her composure, the legendary composure of the strongest queen, finally, visibly cracking. "That signature," she said, very quietly, as if saying it louder might make it more true than it already, undeniably was. "I know it. I have felt an echo of it exactly once before, in records sealed before either of us was born. It is not a corruption. It is not a foreign power that found its way into him." She looked at Issei, really looked at him, and what she saw made her take an involuntary step back. "It is the original. Uncorrupted. The soul the old Satan faction has spent 10,000 years pretending never existed, because admitting it survived would mean admitting their entire claim to the throne was built on a lie." Silence settled over the broken circle, total and absolute, broken only by the slow, heavy beat of 12 wings that did not belong to any devil born in the last 10 millennia, but to the very first one. Issei looked down at his own hands, dark and pale light still curling faintly off his fingertips, and felt something inside him that was older than fear and steadier than grief settle into place like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting 10,000 years to be found. "I think," he said quietly, to no one in particular, "we have a lot to talk about." Behind him, unnoticed in the chaos, the broken pieces of the modified king's crystal dissolved into motes of colorless light and scattered into nothing, the last trace of a contract that had never, not even for a moment, managed to hold him. Chapter 2. No one moved for a long moment. The brazier in the corner guttered, as if even fire understood there was nothing useful it could add to the silence. It was Kiba who broke it, retrieving his sword from where it had skidded across the stone and sheathing it with deliberate, controlled slowness, the kind of motion a soldier makes when he wants his hands to have something to do besides shake. "Butcho," he said carefully, "what do we do?" "I don't know," Rias admitted, and the admission cost her visibly. She had always known what to do. It was, in some unspoken way, the entire shape of her authority, the certainty that filled the room and made other people feel safe inside it. She did not feel certain now. She felt, for the first time since she had been a child watching her brother's coronation from the wings of a throne room far too large for her, entirely out of her depth. Akino's hand had not left Rias's shoulder. Her dark eyes were fixed on Issei with an expression that was difficult to parse, something between caution and a kind of awe she clearly did not want to be feeling. "Issei-kun," she said, and her voice had none of its usual teasing warmth. "Are you still you underneath all that?" "I'm still me," Issei said. The wings at his back shifted, settling lower, less a display now than simply a part of him, the way arms or legs were a part of him. I'm not sure how to explain it. It's not like something climbed inside and pushed me out. It's more like I just remembered I was always two things, and one of them was bigger than I knew. He looked down at his own hands again, flexing his fingers slowly, testing them. I'm still scared. I want you to know that. I'm still the same idiot who panics during exams and forgets to do laundry. I just also apparently used to be the first devil who ever existed, so that's a lot to process on a Tuesday. It should have been funny. Under any other circumstances, it might have eased the tension in the room half a degree. Instead, it only deepened the silence, because everyone present understood, with varying degrees of horror, exactly what those words meant for the architecture of the world they lived in. Grayfia had recovered some of her composure, though her eyes had not left Issei since she'd spoken the name. Lucifuge protocol requires that I report this immediately, she said. To my husband. To the Satan faction in full. She paused. I want you to understand that this is not a threat, Issei. It is simply true. What you are cannot remain unknown. Too much of our world's foundation rests on what we believed about how the first Lucifer's line ended. I understand, Issei said. I'm not asking you to hide it. I wouldn't even know how. He hesitated, then added more quietly, but I'd ask you to tell them the truth of what happened here. That I didn't seize anything. That this woke up because your piece tried to bury it, not because I went looking for a throne. I will tell them exactly what I witnessed, Grayfia said. Nothing more, nothing less. That has always been my way. Rias finally found her footing enough to step forward, though she stopped short of the place where the circle had cracked, as if some part of her still understood that the ground there was no longer entirely safe to stand on. Issei. I need you to know that nothing about how I feel toward you has changed because of this. You are still the boy I brought back from the dead a year and a half ago. You are still your servant, Issei finished gently, when she couldn't. Rias, I'm not. Not anymore. The piece is gone. I watched it dissolve. He said it without anger, which somehow made it land harder than if he had shouted it. I don't think I can be anyone's servant now. I don't think it would even hold if you tried again. That's not what I was going to say. I know. But it's still true. He met her eyes, and for a moment something passed between them that was not hostility, was not even really grief yet, but the particular ache of two people watching a bridge wash out beneath them in real time, knowing they had built it together and knowing, just as certainly, that it could not bear what either of them needed to carry across it now. I'm not leaving because I'm angry, Rias. I'm leaving because I have to figure out what I actually am, and I can't do that as a piece on someone else's board. Not even yours. Kaneko had risen from the steps at some point during this exchange, her small frame tense, ears and tail flickering into visibility the way they did when her composure slipped. Senpai, she said, and there was something raw in the honorific now, are you saying you're not part of the family anymore? It was Issei's turn to look pained, the ancient weight in his eyes briefly giving way to something achingly young and ordinary. I don't know what I am yet, Kaneko. I'm sorry. I wish I had a better answer than that. She didn't say anything else. She simply turned and walked out of the room, and the sound of the door closing behind her felt louder than the explosion that had cracked the circle. Kiba watched her go, then looked back at Issei with an expression that had hardened somewhere in the last few minutes into something more guarded. For what it's worth, he said, I don't think you're lying about any of this. I just think the rest of us are going to need time to figure out what it means that the strongest devil who ever lived just woke up in our basement. He gave a short, humorless laugh. That's a sentence I never expected to say out loud. None of us did, Aquino murmured. Rias was quiet for a long moment, her arms wrapped around herself in a way that made her look, briefly, much younger than her centuries. What happens now? She finally asked. Not to Issei specifically. To the room. To whatever law governed a situation that no living devil had ever had to navigate. It was Grayfia who answered, her voice returning to its formal register, the register of a queen reporting to her king rather than a woman who had, moments ago, looked genuinely frightened. Now I take this to Lucifuge Castle. The Satans will need to convene. The old Satan faction will need to be informed carefully, because I promise you, Rias Gremory, the moment they learn what has awakened in Ko, This ceases to be a matter of one peerage's loyalty and becomes a matter that touches the throne itself. She turned to Issei. And you, I think, should not remain inside Gremory territory while that conversation happens. Not because anyone here intends you harm. Because I am not certain, anymore, that everyone here is capable of guaranteeing your safety, and a king who cannot be protected by his own walls should not pretend that he can. The word king did something to the room. Rias flinched, almost imperceptibly. Akino's breath caught. Even Kiba's composed face tightened at the corner of his jaw. Issei felt it too, the word settling onto his shoulders alongside the crown of dark iron and pale light that had not yet faded from his brow, and for a moment the ancient patience inside him and the frightened 18-year-old boy who had never asked for any of this were, entirely and uncomfortably, the very same person. Okay, he said quietly. Then I should go. He turned toward the door, 12 wings folding slowly down against his back, dark and pale together, and felt every set of eyes in the room follow him as he went. None of them tried to stop him. He was not sure, in that moment, that any of them could have. Chapter 3. Issei walked out of Ko Academy a little past midnight, with nothing but the clothes on his back, a crown that would not stop glowing faintly at the edge of his vision no matter how hard he tried to will it away, and a hollow feeling in his chest that no amount of ancient memory could fill. He did not know where he was going. He only knew he could not stay. The town looked the same as it always had, sleepy storefronts and quiet streets, and the distant hum of the river, and there was something almost cruel about that, the world's refusal to look any different despite how completely his place inside it had just been rewritten. He walked without a destination for nearly an hour, his new wings drawn in tight and cloaked, as Grayfia had taught him in the rush 10 minutes before he left, beneath a veil of devil magic that kept him from looking like anything other than a tired teenager out too late. It was at the edge of the old shrine grove, where the trees grew close enough together to blot out the street lights, that he became aware he was being watched. You walk like a man carrying something heavier than himself, a voice said from the dark above him, low and amused and unmistakably feline in its cadence. Issei stopped walking. He looked up into the branches and found a pair of golden eyes looking back, and beneath them, perched with the easy, impossible balance of something that had never once in its life worried about falling, a woman with black hair and twin cat ears that twitched, once, with curiosity. Kuroka, he said. He knew the name. Everyone in the supernatural world knew the name, the rogue Nekashu who had killed her own master years ago, and vanished into rumor and legend, hunted on sight by every faction with a grudge against her. You know me. She tilted her head unbothered. That's not usually a good sign for me. People who know me tend to want me dead, or in chains, or both, depending on how creative they're feeling. Her eyes drifted, almost lazily, toward the place above his head where the faint crown light still flickered despite the veil. But you're not reaching for a sword. You're not even surprised to see me sitting in a tree at midnight, which tells me you've had a stranger night than I have, and that's saying something, because my nights are rarely what you'd call normal. Issei almost laughed, despite everything. Yeah. You could say that. She dropped from the branch without visible effort, landing in a low crouch and rising with the boneless ease of something more cat than human, and circled him once, slow, her tail flicking, reading him the way a predator reads anything unfamiliar that has wandered into its territory. You smell like devil, she said. But not like any devil I've ever smelled before. There's something old underneath the new, something that doesn't belong to this century, or the one before it, or probably the 10 before that. She stopped in front of him, golden eyes narrowing with genuine interest now rather than mere curiosity. What are you, little dragon? You can smell the boosted gear too? I can smell everything, sweetheart. Comes with the ears. She grinned, showing a hint of something sharper than human teeth. So. Old devil power wrapped around a sacred gear, wandering the human world alone at midnight, looking like he just lost a fight with his own family. I've got a guess. I'd like to hear you say it's wrong. I don't think I can. Issei found himself, against every instinct of caution that should have governed a conversation with a wanted criminal in the middle of the night, telling her. Some of it, at least the broken piece, the wings, the word Lucifer landing in a basement room like a verdict. He was not sure why he trusted her enough to say it out loud, except that she was the first person all night who had looked at him without flinching, without grief, without the particular fear of someone watching the ground shift beneath everything they'd believed. Kuroka listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, until he finished. Well, she said finally. That's certainly a Tuesday. That's what I said. Smart boy. She studied him a moment longer, and something in her posture shifted, the predatory looseness giving way, just slightly, to something more considering. You know what I am, dragon boy. Stray. Murderer, by most accounts, though I'd argue the details if anyone ever asked me, which they don't, because most of the supernatural world decided a long time ago that the story was simple and they liked it simple. Her tail curled around her own leg, an oddly vulnerable gesture for someone who carried herself like she owned every shadow she stood in. Every faction wants me dead or caged. The old Satan crowd especially. They love their order. Love their bloodlines and their hierarchies and their nice clean story about who's allowed to exist and who isn't. Her golden eyes found his again, sharp and assessing. And here you are, the story underneath their story, the thing they'd buried because admitting it existed would mean admitting the whole tower was built on a lie. I didn't ask for any of this, Issei said quietly. Nobody interesting ever does. She smiled, and this time there was no edge in it, only something warmer, something that looked almost like recognition. I've spent years running from people who think the world only has room for what they already decided to allow. You're about to spend the rest of your life as the thing that proves they were wrong about what's allowed to exist at all. She rolled her shoulders, stretching like she'd just woken from a long nap, and the motion was so unbothered, so entirely unimpressed by the weight of what he just told her, that something in Issei's chest loosened for the first time in hours. I like that, actually. I like it a lot. Is that your way of saying you believe me? It's my way of saying I'm bored, and homeless, and very good at fighting people who think they're better than me. She offered him a hand, claw-sheathed but visible at the edges, an invitation rather than a threat. If you're about to go make an entire faction of self-important old men very uncomfortable, dragon boy, I want a front row seat. Maybe even a part to play, if you're not too proud to let a stray cat fight beside you. Issei looked at her outstretched hand for a long moment. He thought of the basement, the cracked circle, Kaniko's back as she walked out the door, Rias's face when she'd realized the bridge between them had washed out. He thought of how alone he had felt for the last hour, walking with no destination and a crown he couldn't take off. He took her hand. I'm Issei, he said. I guess, technically, I'm also Lucifer. I haven't fully worked out how those two things fit together yet. Kuroka, she said, though he already knew, her grip firm and warm and entirely unafraid. And don't worry about working it out tonight. Some things you figure out by doing, not thinking. I'm a great teacher in that department. Her grin widened, sharp and delighted. Come on, little throne thief. Let's go find you somewhere to sleep that isn't a sidewalk, and tomorrow we can start figuring out exactly how much trouble the true Lucifer is about to cause. For the first time since the piece had shattered against his chest, Issei felt something that was almost dangerously close to hope. Chapter 4. Lucifuge Castle stood the way it always had, vast and silver-spired against the perpetual dusk of the underworld sky, and Grayfia walked its halls with a composure she had rebuilt, piece by careful piece, on the long journey back from Kuo. By the time she reached the war room where her husband waited, she looked, to any outside observer, entirely herself again. Sirzechs Lucifer rose from his seat the moment she entered. He had known, the instant her summons arrived, that whatever she needed to report could not wait for morning. Tell me, he said simply. She told him. All of it, in the precise, unembellished language she had used her entire career, the kind of report that left no room for rumor to fill in the gaps later. The fluctuation the Citri family had detected. The decision to attempt containment. The modified piece. Its rejection. The wings, dark and pale, 12 in total. The crown that had settled, unbidden, upon a boy's brow in a basement that had cracked open beneath the weight of what woke inside him. And the name. The one she had spoken aloud only once, in that basement, and had not said again since, because saying it felt like striking a match in a room full of dry paper. Sirzechs did not interrupt her once. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his hand resting on the back of his chair, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and a kind of grim, exhausted recognition, as though some part of him had always suspected this day might come and had simply hoped it would come for someone else's reign. "You're certain," he said finally. "I have felt True Lucifer's signature exactly once before in my life," Grayfia said. "In the sealed archive, the night you showed me the original records as a warning about what our family name actually cost to claim. I did not imagine the resemblance, Sirzechs. I would not bring you a guess on a matter this large." He exhaled slowly, and for a moment he looked less like the Crimson Satan and more like a man who had inherited a title built on a story he had never been entirely comfortable telling. 10,000 years, he murmured. 10,000 years of believing the original line ended in the Civil War. Of building an entire system of governance on the premise that the throne was, by necessity, ours to redefine, because there was no one left with the blood to contest it. He looked up at her. "If this is true, Grayfia, it does not merely complicate my reign. It unmakes the foundation it was built on. I am aware of the implications. And the boy himself? What does he want?" Grayfia considered the question with the same care she gave to everything. "He did not ask for a throne," she said. "I watched his face when the crown settled on him. It frightened him more than it pleased him. He asked only that I tell the truth of what happened, that he had not sought this, that the peace tried to bury something it could not control, and the something fought back. I believe him. Whatever he ultimately becomes, I do not believe ambition is what woke him. That will not matter to the old Satan faction," Sirzechs said quietly. "They will not care what he wants. They will care only what he is, and what his existence costs them to acknowledge." He was right, and they both knew it. The old Satan faction, the block of devil nobility who had never fully accepted the new Satan's reforms, who still spoke in hushed rooms about restoring the old hierarchy, the old purity laws, the old order in which power flowed downward from a handful of approved bloodlines and nowhere else, had spent 10,000 years building their legitimacy on the comfortable fiction that the true Lucifer line was extinct, its claim to the throne forever settled, its absence a closed question rather than an open wound. A living heir, awakened, witnessed, undeniable, was not merely an inconvenience to that fiction. It was its death sentence. "They will try to erase the question before it can be asked publicly," Grayfia said. "Quietly, if they can manage it. Issei is currently unaffiliated, ungoverned by any peerage, and largely unprotected beyond whatever strength he commands on his own. That makes him vulnerable in exactly the way they would prefer. Then we cannot allow that vulnerability to stand unanswered." Sirzechs moved to the room's tall window, looking out over the spires of a city built, in no small part, on a story he was only now beginning to understand might have always been incomplete. "I will not move against my own faction's stated history without proof the entire underworld can witness, Grayfia. That would tear us apart from the inside faster than the old Satans ever could from the outside. But I also will not let an 18-year-old boy, however ancient the soul sleeping beneath his face, be hunted in the dark by men who have spent 10 millennia perfecting the art of making inconvenient people disappear quietly. What would you have me do?" He turned back to her, and something in his expression had hardened into the particular resolve she had married, decades ago, precisely because of how rarely and how completely he allowed himself to wear it. "Find him," he said. "Not to summon him here, not yet. The old Satans have ears in this castle that I have not finished rooting out. Find him, and tell him this. He is not without allies. Whatever he chooses to become, throne claimant or quiet exile, my house will not be the one that hunts him for the crime of existing." He paused. "And Grayfia, watch for Kuroka. If she has already found him, as your report suggests is possible, then he has stumbled onto an ally more useful than he likely understands. The old Satan faction fears her reputation. They will think twice before moving against the target she has chosen to protect." Grayfia inclined her head, already turning toward the door, already calculating the fastest route back to the human world. "And Rias?" Sirzechs' jaw tightened, the only outward sign of the grief he was clearly not permitting himself to fully feel yet. "My sister meant well," he said quietly. I know that as certainly as I know anything. But meaning well has never once stopped a mistake from costing what mistakes cost. He looked back out the window. Tell her I do not blame her, when you see her next. And tell her, gently, that the boy she lost tonight was never entirely the one she thought she'd saved to begin with. Far above the castle, in chambers neither Sirzechs nor Grayfia could see, in halls where old portraits of devils long dead watched over rooms heavy with incense and older grudges, a different conversation was already beginning, conducted in the clipped, careful language of men who had spent 10,000 years learning exactly how to make inconvenient truths disappear before they could be witnessed by anyone who mattered. The name Lucifer was being spoken there too. Not with grief. Not with wonder. With calculation. Chapter 5. Issei woke on the second morning of his new life in a cheap rented room above a noodle shop on the outskirts of a town 2 prefectures from Ko, with Kuroka curled, cat-like and unbothered, in the room's single armchair, and the distinct, prickling sense that someone was standing outside the door. He sat up. Kuroka's eyes opened a half-second later, golden alert, though she did not move from her curl. Not a threat, she said before he could ask. I'd smell a threat. This is something else. Something that smells like rain and ozone and a decision someone hasn't fully made yet. The knock, when it came, was soft. Issei opened the door to find Akino Himejima standing in the narrow hallway, still in her school uniform despite the distance she must have traveled to find him, her dark hair slightly windswept, her usual composed smile entirely absent from her face. Akino. He stepped back automatically, making room. How did you even find me? I have my methods. She didn't move to come in right away, hovering at the threshold with an uncertainty that looked strange on her. Akino who flirted with danger the way other people made small talk, Akino who had never once, in Issei's experience, looked unsure of where she was supposed to stand. I needed to see you before I made a decision I can't take back. Kuroka uncurled from the armchair with lazy interest, golden eyes flicking between them. I'll give you the room, she said, stretching as she rose. Try not to set anything on fire. I like this armchair. She slipped out past Akino with a knowing look that Akino pointedly ignored, and the door clicked shut behind her. Issei gestured Akino toward the small table by the window. She sat, finally, hands folded tightly in her lap, and for a long moment said nothing at all. You know what I am, she said eventually. Half-fallen angel. Barakiel's daughter. I've spent my whole life trying to be devil enough that nobody looks too closely at the other half. The half my mother died because of. The half that got her hunted and killed and left me alone before I was old enough to understand why. Her hands tightened in her lap. Rias gave me a place to belong when I had nowhere else to put that shame. I owe her everything. I would have said, until 2 nights ago, that there was nothing in this world that could make me question that. And now I watched her try to bury something inside you because it frightened her, and I keep thinking about all the years I spent burying half of myself for the exact same reason. Akino's eyes finally lifted to meet his, and there was something raw in them, something that had clearly cost her a great deal to let show. I'm not angry at her, Issei. I want to be clear about that. I understand why she did it. I understand the fear underneath it better than almost anyone could, because I have spent my entire life being afraid of the same thing in myself. What thing? The part of me that isn't safe. That isn't sanctioned. That doesn't fit neatly into anyone's idea of what a good devil, a loyal servant, a manageable piece on someone's board is supposed to be. She laughed, short and humorless. Do you know what it's like, being told your whole life that half of what you are is a liability to be managed, suppressed, kept quiet so it doesn't make anyone uncomfortable? I do. I've lived it since I was 7 years old. Her gaze sharpened, fixing on him with an intensity that made the air in the small room feel suddenly thinner. And then I watched you, the most powerful thing any of us have ever stood beside, get the exact same treatment. A piece designed to find the part of you that didn't fit the story and bury it before it could become inconvenient. Her voice dropped. I don't think I can keep pretending that's acceptable, Issei. Not for you. And if I'm honest with myself, not for me either. Issei sat with that for a long moment, the weight of what she was actually asking settling slowly into place. Akino. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm tired of being half of myself for other people's comfort. She straightened, and something in her posture shifted, the uncertainty giving way to a resolve that looked, for the first time since she'd arrived, entirely her own rather than borrowed from anyone else's expectations. I'm saying that whatever you become, throne or exile or something the world hasn't got a word for yet, I want to be there for it as exactly what I am. Not the devil half pretending the fallen half doesn't exist. Both. All of it. No more managing the parts of myself that other people find inconvenient. You'd be leaving Rias's peerage, Issei said quietly. You understand that's what this means. I understand. Pain flickered across her face, quick and real, before she steadied it. I love her. I will always love her, for what she gave me when I had nothing. But love isn't the same as staying somewhere that needs me to keep hiding to be safe. I learned that the hard way once already. I don't intend to learn it again. She reached up, almost without thinking, and touched the place at her back where, Issei knew, both wingsets waited beneath whatever veil she kept them under. I want to stop hiding what I am, Issei. I think you're the first person who's ever made that feel possible instead of dangerous. The room was quiet for a long moment, the distant clatter of the noodle shop below the only sound between them. I can't promise you safety, Issei finally said. I don't even know what I'm walking into yet. The old Satan faction already wants me gone, quietly, before I become a problem they can't manage. Anyone who stands with me is standing in that line of fire too. I've spent my whole life standing in someone's line of fire for the crime of what my blood is, Aquino said, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she almost smiled, fierce and a little sad and entirely sincere. I'd rather stand in it as all of myself, besides someone who isn't asking me to apologize for any part of what that means, than keep spending it small and safe and only half real. Issei looked at her for a long moment. This girl he had known for over a year and somehow, he realized now, had never fully seen, not like this, not with the mask of easy teasing finally set aside. Okay, he said quietly. Then welcome to whatever this is becoming. Aquino let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years, not just days, and when her shoulders dropped, the fallen half of her heritage that she had spent a lifetime keeping carefully veiled finally, visibly, unmistakably surfaced, dark feathered wings unfurling slowly into the small room's light alongside the devil wings she had never fully hidden, both halves of her, at last, allowed to exist in the same breath. Welcome to whatever this is becoming, she echoed, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the words did not feel like a confession. They felt like an arrival. Chapter 6. The chamber beneath House Indra's ancestral seat had not been used in over a century, which was precisely why the four men gathered there had chosen it. No wards to register their presence. No servants to overhear. Only old stone, older portraits, and the particular silence that settles over rooms built for conversations no one is meant to repeat. Lord Indra sat at the head of the table, a thin man with the kind of stillness that came less from calm than from decades of practiced restraint. To his left sat Lord Agars, broader, older, his fingers steepled before him in a gesture he had not changed since before Sirzechs was born. Across from them, Lady Viper, the only woman in the room and by most accounts the sharpest mind in it, listened with her hands folded and her expression carefully blank. The fourth chair belonged to a man who gave no name in rooms like this one, only a title, spoken without irony, the voice of the old accord. You are certain of the report, Lord Indra said, addressing no one and everyone. Grayfia Lucifuge does not exaggerate, the voice said. If she says she witnessed 12 wings and a crown that was not forged by any smith in the underworld, then she witnessed exactly that. The boy is precisely what the signature suggests. Lord Agars exhaled slowly through his nose, a sound that carried more contempt than any words might have. 10,000 years, he said. 10,000 years we have told every generation born into this world that the original line ended in fire, that the throne passed because there was no one left to inherit it. 10,000 years of careful history, and it turns out the truth was sitting in a human academy this entire time, wearing a sacred gear like a child's toy. The fault is not in the history, Lady Viper said quietly. The fault is in whoever decided a modified piece was a safe way to handle a signature they did not understand. Sirzechs' faction has handed us a problem of their own making, and now expects the rest of us to absorb the consequences of their carelessness. Does it matter how it happened? Lord Indra's voice was mild, almost gentle, the way men who have ordered terrible things often speak when the terrible thing is still hypothetical. What matters is what it means if it is allowed to stand. A living heir to the true line, untethered from any peerage, unaffiliated with any house, unbound by any of the structures that have kept this society stable for 10 millennia. Do you understand what happens to our position, to every claim our houses have built across that span of time, if the underworld learns the throne was never truly settled at all? No one answered because they all understood it perfectly well. The entire architecture of the old Satan faction's legitimacy, their claims to ancestral seats, their resistance to Sirzechs' reforms, their quiet insistence that the old hierarchies deserved restoration precisely because the new order had been built on a throne that was, by their own telling, rightfully and permanently vacant, all of it rested on the comfortable certainty that no one could ever contest the foundation. A living Lucifer, awakened and witnessed, did not merely complicate that certainty. It obliterated it. He must be removed, Lord Agar said flatly, the way a man discusses a structural repair rather than a life. Quietly. Before the wider underworld learns enough to ask questions we cannot control the answers to. He is currently unaffiliated and largely unprotected, the voice offered. No peerage. No formal house backing. Grayfia's report suggests he has, at most, the Nekesha stray for company, a criminal with no standing to invoke on his behalf even if she wished to. Then it should be simple, Lord Agar said. It should be, Lady Viper agreed, though something in her tone suggested she did not entirely share his confidence. Except that Sirzechs has almost certainly already moved to extend some manner of unofficial protection. He will not act publicly. His own faction's stability depends on him appearing to respect due process in a matter this delicate. But he will not simply allow an asset of this magnitude to be erased without resistance either, whatever public face he wears. She tapped one finger against the table, slow and considering. And if the boy is even half as powerful as the original line's signature suggests, a direct assault risks more than it resolves. We are not merely talking about removing an inconvenient witness. We may be talking about provoking the single most dangerous individual born into this world in 10,000 years, while he is frightened, isolated, and uncertain of his own strength. Frightened and isolated people make unpredictable enemies, gentlemen. I would rather we did not manufacture one needlessly. Then what do you propose? Lord Indra asked. Lady Viper considered the question with the same unhurried care she gave to everything. Patience, she said finally. Let him believe, for now, that he has slipped beneath our notice. Let him gather what allies he will gather, the stray cat, perhaps others drawn to whatever cause he decides to champion. A scattered handful of outcasts and discontents is far easier to discredit, isolate, and eventually dismantle than a single sympathetic boy standing alone. Her eyes moved across the table, cold and precise. We do not need to erase him quickly. We need to erase him cleanly, in a way that the wider underworld will accept as justified rather than question as murder. That requires patience, gentlemen, and the right provocation, manufactured carefully, at the right time. And if he grows too strong before we find that opening? The voice asked. Lady Viper's expression did not change. Then we accelerate, she said simply. But not before. A wounded animal that knows it is cornered fights with everything it has. I would much rather we let him believe he has room to run, right up until the moment we close every door at once. Lord Indra nodded slowly, satisfied, and rose from his chair, the others following a beat behind him in the careful, practiced hierarchy that had governed this room and rooms like it for longer than most living devils could remember. Then we are agreed, he said. Patience. Observation. And when the moment comes, we will not strike at a king. His mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. We will simply remind the underworld that a king without a kingdom, without a faction, without the proper sanction of the houses that built this world, is nothing more than a very dangerous, very temporary rumor. The chamber emptied, one careful, unhurried figure at a time, leaving only old stone and older portraits to bear silent witness to a decision that would not be spoken of again in any room with walls that could repeat it. Far above, in the human world, In a small rented room above a noodle shop, Issei Hyoudou slept with 12 wings folded close against his back and no idea at all that he had just become, in the space of a single quiet conversation, the most carefully hunted secret in the history of the Underworld. Chapter 7. 3 weeks into what Kuroka had taken to calling their little exile, Issei learned that the hardest part of being the most powerful devil in 10,000 years was not the power itself. It was figuring out how to stop it from spilling out of him at the worst possible moments. They had relocated twice since the noodle shop, first to an abandoned ryokan in the mountains that Kuroka swore was unclaimed by any faction, then to a stretch of forest further north when even that began to feel too close to roads other people traveled. Akino had taken to the nomadic rhythm of it with an ease that surprised him, as though some part of her had been waiting her whole life for permission to stop pretending she belonged to a fixed and tidy world. Again, Kuroka said, perched on a fallen log at the clearing's edge, golden eyes half-lidded in a way that fooled no one into thinking she wasn't watching everything. And this time, Dragon Boy, try not to flatten the tree line. Issei rolled his shoulders, 12 wings settling and resettling behind him in a rhythm he still hadn't fully mastered, dark and pale shifting against each other like two different weather systems sharing the same sky. Easy for you to say. You don't have two completely different kinds of power trying to wear the same body. I have several kinds of power trying to wear this body, thank you very much, and most of them want to scratch something. Kuroka's tail flicked, unbothered. The difference is I've had centuries to make peace with all of it being mine. You've had 3 weeks. Stop expecting yourself to look graceful. Just stop blowing up the scenery. Akino, seated cross-legged a safe distance away with her own wings, both sets, finally allowed to exist openly in the same breath, watched with the focused attention of someone determined to learn the lesson even though it wasn't being taught to her. He's not wrong to struggle, she said. Dark and light aren't supposed to share a single will this easily. Fallen power and devil power fight each other inside me too, just on a much smaller scale. You're asking him to hold 2 whole religions of magic in one hand without dropping either. Helpful context, thank you, Issei muttered, closing his eyes and trying again. The exercise was simple in theory and brutal in practice. Draw a small measure of dark wing power into one palm and pale wing power into the other, and bring them together without either cancelling the other out or detonating into the kind of blast that had, on the first attempt, taken out a 15-foot stretch of pine trees and earned him an unimpressed look from Kuroka that he still hadn't lived down. He drew the power slowly this time. The dark came easily, heavy and patient, old in a way that felt less like a memory and more like a posture his bones already knew how to hold. The pale was harder, sharper, almost painful to hold steady, judgment given shape and weight, the kind of light that did not forgive mistakes so much as illuminate them mercilessly. He brought his hands together. For one fragile second, the two forces hovered between his palms in a coiled, shivering balance, and Issei felt something settle into place that hadn't been there a heartbeat before, the sense of 2 halves of an old, broken whole recognizing each other for the first time in 10,000 years. Then it slipped, and the clearing exploded in a column of crimson-white light that this time, mercifully, only took out a single unlucky sapling rather than a stretch of forest. Better, Kuroka said deadpan, as the smoke cleared. Only one casualty. The sapling sends its regards. Issei dropped to one knee, breathing hard, sweat cooling on his neck despite the spring chill. I felt it, he said between breaths. For a second. They weren't fighting each other. They were just both there. At the same time. That's the part that matters, Akino said, rising and crossing the scorched grass to crouch beside him, her expression warm in a way that had become more frequent and less guarded with every week that passed. You're not trying to force 2 things to agree, Issei. You're trying to remember they were never actually opposed to begin with. Light and dark only look like enemies to people who've never held both at once. Where'd you get that, a fortune cookie? My mother, actually. Something flickered across her face, old grief worn smooth by years of handling. She used to say the angels who fell weren't punished for becoming dark. They were punished for refusing to pretend the dark wasn't already part of what they'd always been. She helped him to his feet. I think about that a lot now. I think you're living a version of the same lesson, just bigger. Kuroka hopped down from her log and sauntered over, inspecting the scorched circle of grass with idle interest. For what it's worth, Dragon Boy, you held it longer this time than the last 3 tries combined. You're not failing. You're just slow, the way everyone interesting is slow at the beginning of becoming something worth being afraid of. She grinned, sharp and fond. Give it another month, and you'll be holding both halves steady enough to actually use them in a fight instead of just making very expensive fireworks. A month feels optimistic. Everything worth having feels optimistic right up until it isn't. She stretched, looking up through the gap in the canopy where the felled sapling had let a little more sky through than there'd been that morning. Besides, Dragon Boy, you're not just training to feel steady. You're training because somewhere out there, men who've spent 10,000 years protecting a very comfortable lie are deciding exactly how and when they want to deal with you. I'd rather you be ready before they make that decision than after. The reminder settled over the clearing like a change in weather, the easy warmth of training giving way, briefly, to the colder truth none of them had said aloud in days. Issei looked down at his hands, the faint residue of dark and pale light still curling off his fingertips, and thought, not for the first time, of the basement in Ko, the cracked stone, Kaniko's back as she walked away. I keep thinking about them, he admitted quietly. Rias. Kiba. Kaniko. I don't know if I'm allowed to miss people I walked away from. You're allowed, Akino said gently. Missing them doesn't mean you were wrong to leave. It just means you loved them, and love doesn't politely disappear because the situation got complicated. She bumped his shoulder with hers, light and grounding. I miss Rias too, if it helps. Doesn't mean I think either of us made the wrong call. Kuroka, watching the two of them with an expression that was, for once, entirely without teasing, said quietly, for what it's worth, Dragon Boy, the world's about to get a lot more complicated before it gets simpler. You should probably know that we're not as alone out here as you might think. Issei looked up sharply. What do you mean? I mean, Kuroka said, golden eyes drifting toward the tree line at the clearing's northern edge, where the shadows had, very subtly, stopped behaving quite like ordinary shadows, that we've had a visitor watching us train for the better part of an hour, and she's finally decided she's ready to stop hiding. The shadows at the clearing's edge shifted, resolving slowly into the unmistakable, silver-haired shape of Grayfia Lucifuge, who stepped into the light with the composed, unhurried bearing of someone who had clearly been deciding, for quite some time, exactly how to announce herself. Forgive the intrusion, she said. I have been watching for longer than is polite. I wanted to see what you were becoming before I decided whether to speak. Issei straightened, wings settling instinctively into a more guarded posture behind him. And? What did you decide? Grayfia's expression, usually so carefully unreadable, softened by a fraction that on anyone else might have gone entirely unnoticed. I decided, she said, that I have spent my entire existence in service to a throne whose foundation I was never permitted to question. And I find, watching you, that I am no longer entirely certain I wish to keep pretending that foundation was ever as solid as I was told. The clearing went very quiet. That's a big thing to say to someone you barely know, Issei said carefully. It is, Grayfia agreed. I have had 3 weeks to consider it. I do not say things I have not fully considered. She took another step forward, silver hair catching the light through the broken canopy, and for the first time since the basement in Ko, Issei saw something in her face that looked, unmistakably, like the beginning of a choice being made in real time rather than after the fact. I came to tell you that the old Satan faction is moving more carefully, more quietly, than even Sirzechs anticipated. And I came to ask whether there might be a place, in whatever you are building out here in the woods with a stray cat and a fallen angel's daughter, for the strongest queen who is beginning to wonder if she has been loyal to the wrong story her entire life. Chapter 8. No one spoke for a long moment. Even Kuroka, who treated most situations with the same unbothered amusement she gave to everything, had gone still, watching Grayfia with an expression that had sharpened into something more serious than her usual lazy curiosity. You're the strongest queen, Issei said finally. You're married to a Satan. You have more to lose than anyone I've met since this started, and you're standing in a forest asking to throw it all away for a boy you've known for 3 weeks. I am aware of exactly what I am offering to set down, Grayfia said. There was no hesitation in her voice, only the same careful precision she brought to everything, a woman who had clearly rehearsed this moment in her head many times before allowing herself to walk into the clearing and say it aloud. I did not arrive at this decision lightly, Issei. I would ask that you not assume I did. Then tell me why, he said. Really tell me. Not the version you'd give Sirzechs in a war room. Grayfia was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, something in her formal cadence loosened, just slightly, into something more personal than Issei had ever heard from her. I was born in the Underworld during the early years of the new Satan reforms, she said. My family served the old hierarchy faithfully for generations before that, the kind of faithfulness that asks no questions because questions were never safe to ask. I was raised to believe that loyalty and obedience were the same virtue wearing two names. I served Sirzechs because I believed, and still largely believe, that he is a better king than the alternative his enemies would prefer. But I have spent my entire adult life enforcing a system I was never permitted to interrogate, and 3 weeks ago, in a basement in Ko, I watched that system reach for a boy who had done nothing wrong and try to bury the truest part of him because the truth was inconvenient to the story we had all agreed to keep telling. That wasn't your fault, Issei said quietly. You didn't design the piece. I did not design it, Grayfia agreed. But I have spent 10,000 years, or near enough, serving an order that has always preferred convenient silence to inconvenient truth. The old Satan faction is not the only part of our world built on comfortable lies, Issei. Sirzechs' reforms are kinder, gentler, more just by every measure I can name. But they are still built, in part, on the same foundational silence about your bloodline that the old houses have spent 10,000 years protecting. I do not believe my husband acted in bad faith. I believe he, like me, simply never allowed himself to ask the question loudly enough to require an answer. Aquino, who had been listening with quiet intensity, said, And now you're asking it. Now I am asking it, Grayfia confirmed. And I find that once a question like that is finally asked aloud, it does not consent to being put away again. She looked at Issei directly, silver eyes steady. I do not offer my service because I believe you are owed a throne, Issei. I do not yet know what I believe about thrones, about claims, about whether any of that machinery deserves to survive in its current form at all. I offer it because I watched a system I dedicated my life to protecting try to erase something true because the truth was dangerous to its comfort, and I find that I am no longer willing to call that protection. I am willing to call it what it is. Complicity. The word landed heavily in the clearing, and for a moment no one moved. What about Sirzechs? Issei asked. Your husband. Your king. What happens to your marriage if you walk out of his service to stand with me? Something passed across Grayfia's face then, brief and private, grief carefully held at arm's length the way only someone with centuries of practice could manage. Sirzechs already gave me leave to find you, Issei. He sent me to tell you that his house would not be the one hunting you. I do not believe he anticipated I would arrive and ask to stay. But I do not believe, either, that he will consider this a betrayal of our marriage so much as a difference in how far each of us is willing to walk down a road we both, in our own ways, can already see needs walking. She allowed herself something that was almost a smile, sad and certain at once. He married a woman who chooses her conscience over her comfort. He will not be surprised that the habit, eventually, found a question large enough to test it fully. Kuroka, who had been silent for the entirety of the exchange, finally spoke, her voice lighter than the moment but not unkind. For what it's worth, Dragon Boy, I vote yes. Strongest queen in the Underworld, switching sides because her conscience finally got too loud to ignore? That's not someone you turn away because the timing feels strange. That's someone you say thank you to, quickly, before she changes her mind. Issei looked between them, Aquino's quiet, steady support, Kuroka's blunt practicality, and Grayfia's carefully composed face, behind which he could see, now that he was looking for it, the same frightened uncertainty he'd felt the night the piece shattered against his chest. Okay, he said. But I need you to understand something first, before you say yes to whatever this becomes. I am listening. I'm not building an army to take a throne because I think I deserve one, Issei said, and the words came out steadier than he expected, something in the certainty of them surprising even himself. I don't actually care about sitting on a chair and being called Satan. I care that the system you just described, the one that buries inconvenient truths to protect comfortable lies, hurt you, and hurt Aquino her whole life, and tried to hurt me in a basement 3 weeks ago. If I end up with a throne at the end of this, it's because the alternative is leaving that system standing exactly as it is, and I don't think I can do that anymore, now that I know what it costs the people inside it. He met her eyes. So if you're staying, Grayfia, you're not staying for a king. You're staying for a fight to change what the throne is even allowed to mean. I need you to want that, specifically, not just want out of where you've been. Grayfia studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression deepened into a respect that had not, Issei suspected, been there a few minutes earlier. That, she said quietly, is precisely what I came here hoping to hear you say. A boy who wanted a crown for its own sake would not have stopped to ask whether I understood what I was agreeing to. She inclined her head, formal even now, even here, in a scorched forest clearing far from any throne room. Then I am yours, Issei Hyoudou, or whatever name history eventually settles on calling you. Not as a queen bound by a peace. As a woman who has finally decided her loyalty belongs to a better question than the one she has spent her life answering. No peace, Issei said. I mean that. I'm not doing that to anyone ever, not after what almost happened to me. I would not have accepted one if you'd offered it, Grayfia said, and for the first time since she'd stepped into the clearing, something like genuine warmth touched her composed face. I have had quite enough of belonging to people through contracts, Issei. I would much rather belong to a cause through conviction. Kuroka clapped her hands together once, breaking the solemnity of the moment with characteristic ease. Wonderful. Now that we've all had our feelings, can someone explain to the new recruit why there's a smoking sapling at the edge of the clearing? Because I promise you, Grayfia, the explanation is funnier than you're expecting. Despite everything, despite the weight of the choice that had just been made, Issei found himself laughing, and beside him, Aquino laughed too, and even Grayfia's composed mouth curved, just slightly, into something that might, with enough time and enough trust, eventually become an easy smile. It was, Issei thought, the first time since the basement that the forest had felt less like a hiding place, and more like the beginning of something that might actually hold. Chapter 9. The attack came 11 days after Grayfia joined them, and it did not come as an army. It came as a dozen stray exorcists, the kind of unaffiliated fanatics the old Satan faction had learned, over centuries, to use precisely because their deaths could never be traced back to a noble house, dressed in plain travel clothes instead of vestments, carrying blessed blades that had been carefully stripped of any insignia that might identify a sponsor. Issei felt them before he saw them, a prickling wrongness against the part of him that had spent the last weeks learning to read the texture of hostile intent the way Kuroka read scent on the wind. He was at the edge of camp, practicing the slow, careful balance of dark and pale power that had become his nightly ritual, when Grayfia's voice cut across the clearing, low and immediate. 12 signatures. Human blessed weaponry. Approaching from the south, spread in a containment pattern. She was already moving, silver hair streaming as she crossed to stand beside him, her usual composed elegance replaced by something colder, sharper, the strongest queen rather than the patient woman who had spent the last week and a half teaching Issei to control his breathing before he reached for power. This is not a random patrol, Issei. Containment patterns are used to corner something you intend to kill cleanly. Someone sent these people specifically for you. Old Satan faction? Issei asked, already feeling the dark and pale wings unfurling instinctively at his back, a readiness his body seemed to understand faster than his mind could catch up to. Almost certainly. Though I would wager every coin I own that none of these 12 know that. Stray exorcists rarely ask who funds the bounty, only how large it is. Grayfia's expression had gone hard in a way Issei hadn't seen from her before, something old and dangerous surfacing beneath the careful composure. They will be expendable to whoever sent them. A probe, to measure your strength, with deniability built into every layer of who actually dies tonight. Kuroka dropped from the treeline above them, landing in a low crouch with claws already extended, golden eyes gone narrow and predatory. Then let's give them something worth measuring, she said, voice dropping into a register that had nothing playful left in it. Aquino's circling wide to flank. I'll take the center. Grayfia, you and the dragon boy hold position and let them come to you, it'll rattle them more than chasing ever would. Agreed, Grayfia said, already stepping forward, ice beginning to crystallize faintly along the edges of her hands. Issei, I know your instinct will be to protect everyone at once. Resist it. Trust that we can hold our own ground. Your task tonight is not to save us. It is to survive long enough to learn what your strength actually looks like under real pressure, because the next attack will not be 12 unaffiliated strays testing the water. It will be calculated, and it will be designed by people who have had weeks to study exactly what frightened you tonight. The exorcists broke from the trilene a moment later, 12 figures moving with the disciplined coordination of people who had trained together, blessed blades catching the moonlight as they spread into the containment formation Grayfia had predicted. The first one to reach striking distance never got the chance to swing. Kuroka was simply there, faster than the eye could comfortably track, claws raking through a defensive ward the man had barely begun to raise, and he went down hard, unconscious rather than dead, a detail Issei noticed with a flicker of relief even in the chaos of the moment. We're not killing them unless they force it, Kuroka called out, almost cheerful despite the violence. They're tools, Dragon Boy, not the hand holding them. No sense making martyrs out of rented muscle. 2 more exorcists converged on Issei directly, blessed blades raised, and Issei felt the old patience inside him rise to meet the threat with a calm that startled him, the 18-year-old fear giving way, for just a moment, to something far older and far steadier. He raised both hands, dark power coiling in his left palm, pale power gathering, hard-won and careful, in his right, and brought them together the way he had practiced for weeks in a scorched forest clearing with no audience but a cat and a fallen angel's daughter. This time, the balance held. The combined light that erupted from his joined palms was not the wild, uncontrolled detonation of his earlier failures. It was focused, a controlled pulse of dark and pale interwoven that swept both exorcists off their feet and left them stunned, breathing, alive, on the scorched grass. Issei stared at his own hands for a half-second, breathless with something that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, before the next wave of exorcists forced his attention back to the fight. Grayfia moved through her opponents with the terrifying, economical grace of someone who had spent centuries perfecting violence into something close to art, ice-forming blades and barriers in the same fluid motion, never a wasted gesture, never a moment of doubt. Aquino descended from above in a controlled spiral of dark feathers and crackling lightning, her twin heritage finally allowed to fight as one unified whole rather than a thing kept carefully separate, and the exorcist she landed before did not get up again, though Issei noted, with the same flicker of relief, that she too had pulled the lethal edge from her strike at the last possible moment. Within minutes it was over. 12 exorcists lay scattered across the clearing, unconscious, disarmed, breathing. Grayfia knelt beside the nearest one, pressing 2 fingers to a point at his temple that made his eyes flutter open despite his unconscious state, a brief, controlled compulsion that Issei recognized from the basement in Ko. The same precise authority that had once tried to bind him now turned toward extracting truth instead. "Who sent you?" she said, voice flat and absolutely without mercy. The man's eyes were glassy, caught in the compulsion's grip. "Don't know," he mumbled. "Contact through a broker. Cash up front." Said the target was a rogue sacred gear user gone unstable. Said it'd be easy? Easy, Grayfia repeated, something cold flickering across her face. She released the compulsion, and the man slumped back into unconsciousness. She rose, brushing scorched grass from her knees, and turned to Issei with an expression that had hardened into pure, focused resolve. A broker. Cash. A cover story designed to make 12 desperate, unaffiliated men believe they were hunting something dangerous rather than something hunted. She looked out over the unconscious bodies scattered across the clearing. "This is precisely the pattern I feared," Issei. Deniable. Untraceable. A probe disguised as an unrelated bounty, designed to teach them how you fight without ever risking a single noble house's fingerprints on the attempt. "They'll learn we held," Issei said quietly, looking at his own hands, still faintly glowing at the edges. "Tonight, at least. They will learn more than that." Grayfia's eyes found his, steady and grave. They will learn that the boy who couldn't hold his own power 3 weeks ago can now combine dark and pale into a controlled, lethal force under real combat pressure. That is not a small thing to have revealed tonight, Issei. It will accelerate their timeline. People like the ones who sent this probe do not wait patiently once they realize the thing they feared is growing faster than they planned for. Kuroka padded over, wiping a faint smear of blood from one claw with idle disinterest, her earlier playfulness gone entirely now. She's right, Dragon Boy. We bought ourselves proof of concept tonight. We didn't buy ourselves time. If anything, we just spent some. Akino landed beside them, her wings folding slowly, both sets at once, dark feathers and devil membrane settling together without contradiction for the first time Issei could remember seeing it look entirely natural on her. Then we stopped treating this like exile, she said, quiet but certain, looking around at the small, scattered group that had somehow, in the space of a few weeks, become something that felt less like refugees and more like the beginning of a household. We start treating it like the opening move of something we actually intend to win. Issei looked around the clearing, at 12 unconscious men who would wake in a few hours with nothing but a confused memory and a missing payday, at Grayfia's hard, calculating focus, at Kuroka's wiped claw, at Akino's steady resolve, and felt the ancient patience inside him settle, finally, into something that looked less like fear and more like purpose. Okay, he said. Then let's stop hiding in the woods waiting for the next probe to find us. He looked up, through the broken canopy, toward a sky that held, somewhere far beyond it, an underworld full of houses that had spent 10,000 years protecting a comfortable lie. Let's go find the people who are tired of that lie too, before the old Satans find a way to bury all of us at once. Chapter 10. They relocated the following morning to a safer position, deeper into unclaimed territory at the forest's northern edge, and that evening, for the first time since the basement in Ko, Issei found himself sitting at the center of what felt less like a campfire and more like a war council. If we're doing this, he said, looking around at the 3 faces gathered with him beneath the canopy, firelight catching against silver hair and golden eyes in the dark, finally unhidden sweep of fallen wings, I want to do it right. Not just gather power for the sake of having enough to survive the next attack. I want to actually understand who we're up against, and who out there might already be tired of the same lie we are. Grayfia, seated with the careful posture of someone who had spent years in actual war rooms, nodded slowly. Then let us begin with what we know. The old Satan faction is not a single unified bloc, whatever face it presents publicly. It is a coalition of old houses bound together more by shared grievance against Sirzechs' reforms than by any single shared conviction. Lord Indra, Lord Agar's, and Lady Viper are among its most influential voices, but there are dozens of lesser houses orbiting their authority, many of whom comply out of fear of losing standing rather than genuine loyalty to the cause. She paused. That means the coalition has fractures, if we are patient enough to find them. And the new Satan faction? Issei asked. Sirzechs. Are they allies or another wall we have to get through? Neither, cleanly, Grayfia admitted. Sirzechs will not move against you publicly, I believe that completely. But he also cannot be seen openly supporting an unaffiliated claimant to a throne his entire reform movement was built around redefining. He is, in his own way, as trapped by the comfortable story as the houses he opposes, simply trapped on a kinder side of it. She met Issei's eyes. I do not say this to discourage you. I say it because you should understand precisely how isolated your position is. You cannot count on the existing power structures, even the friendly ones, to fight this battle for you. You can only count on people willing to stand outside those structures entirely. Akino, staring into the fire, said quietly, then we need people who already stand outside them. Not devils trying to reform the system from a safe seat inside it. People the system already failed, or already feared, or already cast out. That, Kuroka said, lounging against a fallen log with her usual unbothered ease, is a much longer list than you might think, Dragon Boy. The Underworld's very good at producing people it doesn't know what to do with. She began counting off on clawed fingers, her tone light but her words precise, the casual delivery of someone who had spent years tracking exactly this kind of information out of necessity. There's a fair number of stray devils scattered across human territory, most hunted the same way I was, for crimes that were a lot more complicated than the official record admits. There's old blood houses who never fully accepted the new Satan reforms either, not out of loyalty to the old hierarchy, but because the reforms didn't go nearly far enough to fix what was actually broken. There's exiled angels and fallen who don't fit neatly into heaven's hierarchy, or the Gregory's either. And there's at least one current Satan who I happen to know has her own complicated feelings about how much of the old system survived the so-called reforms intact. You mean Seraphal, Grayfia said. I mean Seraphal, Kuroka confirmed. Leviathan herself. She's loud, she's strange, half the underworld thinks she's harmless because she dresses like a magical girl and acts like one too, and every single person who's underestimated her on that basis has regretted it eventually. She's also, from what I've heard through channels I won't bore you with, increasingly frustrated that the new Satan reforms stalled out exactly where they became inconvenient for the old houses to fully accept. A Satan with that kind of quiet frustration is worth more to us than an army of strays, if we can find a way to reach her without putting her in an impossible position. Issei turned the names over slowly, feeling the shape of a strategy beginning to form, not the desperate, reactive survival of the last few weeks, but something closer to an actual plan. We're not trying to build an army to march on the underworld, he said, thinking it through aloud. Not yet, maybe not ever, if there's a better way. We're trying to build a coalition wide enough, and credible enough, that when the truth about what I am finally goes public, on our terms instead of theirs, there are enough voices already standing with us that the old Satan faction can't just quietly erase the conversation. Precisely, Grayfia said, something like approval warming her formal tone. A throne seized by force alone is a throne forever contested by force. But a claim supported by old blood houses, exiled and outcast factions, and at least one sitting Satan willing to vouch for its legitimacy, that becomes something the old Satan faction cannot simply dismiss as a rogue sacred gear user gone unstable, which I suspect is precisely the cover story they intend to keep using until it no longer holds. It's already the cover story, Issei said grimly, remembering the exhausted, glassy-eyed exorcist mumbling those exact words under Grayfia's compulsion the night before. Then we have very little time before that story hardens into something the wider underworld simply accepts without question, Grayfia said. Public perception, once settled, is far harder to dislodge than private conviction. We must reach the people worth reaching before the old Satan faction finishes convincing the rest of the underworld there is nothing here worth looking at. Akino looked up from the fire. Something resolved had settled into her expression. Then where do we start? Kuroka stretched, rising from her log with the easy confidence of someone already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. I know where to find at least 2 stray devils who join a fight against the old Satan faction without needing much convincing, she said. Old friends. Or close enough. People who got the same treatment I did, hunted for crimes that were a lot more complicated than the official story, and never got the chance to tell their side to anyone who mattered. Her golden eyes glinted in the firelight, sharp and certain. And I think, Dragon Boy, it's time you met them. Issei looked around the fire once more, at Grayfia's steady calculation, at Akino's quiet resolve, at Kuroka's eager readiness, and felt the weight of the crown that still, faintly, glowed at the edge of his vision settle into something that finally felt less like an accident he was trapped inside and more like a responsibility he was choosing, deliberately, to carry. Okay, he said. Then let's go find them. All of them. Everyone the underworld decided wasn't worth protecting. He looked up at the dark canopy above, 12 wings shifting slowly at his back, dark and pale finally beginning to feel less like 2 warring inheritances and more like a single, patient whole. If they want to call what we're building a rebellion, fine. But I'd rather call it the first honest accounting that world's had in 10,000 years. Chapter 11. The stray devils Kuroka had spoken of were hiding in the ruins of an old temple complex 3 days' travel north, abandoned long enough ago that moss had claimed most of the stonework, and the local human population had quietly decided to forget the place existed at all. Stay behind me when we get close, Kuroka warned, as the 4 of them picked their way through overgrown stone steps in the late afternoon light. Biko's friendly enough once he knows you're not a hunting party, but he hits first and asks questions never if he's startled. And Lu Fei's shy. Don't crowd her, Biko, Issei repeated. That name sounds familiar. Should. He claims descent from a certain very famous monkey king, and he's not lying, not that it makes him any less of a headache to argue with. Kuroka grinned over her shoulder. He got branded a stray for refusing to fight in a border skirmish he thought was unjust. Old blood politics. His former master wanted blood, Biko wanted a peace treaty, and you can guess which opinion got him cast out. They found him exactly where Kuroka expected, sitting atop a crumbling pagoda with a heavy iron staff across his knees, watching their approach with sharp, unbothered interest from the moment they entered the temple grounds. Beside him, mostly hidden in the pagoda's shadow, a younger girl in a witch's hat peered out at them with wide, wary eyes, one hand resting on a staff of her own. Kuroka, Biko called down, grinning. Took you long enough. I was starting to think you'd forgotten where I was hiding. I never forget where my favorite headaches are hiding, Kuroka called back. Brought some people I think you'll want to meet. Biko dropped from the pagoda's height with an ease that suggested the fall meant nothing to him, landing in a crouch and rising to look over the group with open curiosity, his eyes settling, after a moment, on Issei, and on the faint, ever-present glow that still traced the edges of the crown he had never quite managed to make invisible. Huh, Biko said. Now that's not a devil signature I've ever felt before. It's a long story, Issei said. I've got time. Looks like you might too, given the company you're keeping. Biko's grin widened, sharp and genuinely interested rather than hostile. Kuroka doesn't bring strangers to my hideout for fun. She's careful about people. So either you're someone worth her trust, or you're about to become a very interesting problem for both of us. Issei told the story again, the way he had to Kuroka in the shrine grove, the way he had, in pieces, to Akino in Grayfia, the basement, the piece, the wings, the crown, the name that had landed like a struck bell in a room that had not been ready to hear it. He found, with each telling, that it came easier, the rawest edges of that night worn slightly smoother by repetition, though never entirely painless. Biko listened without interrupting, his expression shifting slowly from skepticism to something more considering, and when Issei finished, he let out a long, low whistle. True Lucifer, he said. 10,000 years of the old Satan crowd insisting that bloodline was dead and buried, and it turns out it was just napping inside a sacred gear user the whole time. He laughed, short and sharp. I love that. I genuinely love that. Do you have any idea how many old blood houses built their entire legitimacy on that line being extinct? I'm starting to understand, Issei said dryly. Then you understand why I'm in. Biko said it simply, without ceremony, the decision apparently requiring far less deliberation than it had from Grayfia. I got cast out for refusing to slaughter people over a border dispute that didn't need blood to settle. The old Satan faction loved that war. Loved the excuse to remind everyone exactly how much power the old houses still held over who lived and who didn't. If you're building something that puts a dent in that, Dragon Boy, I don't need a long speech to convince me. I need a fight worth showing up for. The girl in the witch's hat had crept closer during the conversation, her wide eyes fixed on Issei with an intensity that suggested she was working through something more complicated than simple curiosity. You really don't want the throne, she said quietly, the first word she'd spoken since they'd arrived. I can tell. Most people who want power, you can feel it on them, like a smell. You don't smell like that. Le Fay, was it? Issei asked gently. She nodded, ducking her head as though startled to have been addressed directly. You're right. I don't want it. I just don't think I can let the people who tried to bury what I am keep doing that to everyone else who doesn't fit their story either. Something in Le Fay's posture eased, just slightly, at that. I was a Cow's Brigade affiliate, she said, the words coming faster now, like a confession she'd been holding too long. Before I left. I didn't agree with most of what they wanted, the destruction, the chaos for its own sake, but I didn't have anywhere else to go that would have me, not after my family in Camelot decided magic like mine was a liability to be quietly managed. Her hands tightened around her staff. I know what it's like to be something people would rather erase than understand. If you're building somewhere that doesn't do that, I want to help. I'm good with barriers, wards, containment magic. I could be useful. You'd be more than useful, Grayfia said, speaking for the first time since the introductions, her tone warm in a way that surprised even Issei. Containment and warding expertise is precisely what we lack. We have been improvising our defenses out of raw power and good instincts. That will not be sufficient forever. Aquino crouched down slightly, meeting Le Fay's eyes at a more level height, her usual easy warmth fully present now. For what it's worth, nobody here is going to ask you to be anything other than exactly what you are. I spent most of my life being told half of what I was needed managing too. It's a relief, finding people who don't ask that of you. Le Fay looked between them, something in her wary posture finally, fully relaxing, and nodded, quiet but certain. Then I'm in too. Biko clapped a heavy hand on Issei's shoulder, nearly staggering him with the force of it. Welcome to the world's strangest rebellion, Dragon Boy. True Lucifer, the strongest queen, a fallen angel's daughter who refuses to pick a side, a neckish stray who terrifies half the underworld, a monkey king's descendant who hates unnecessary wars, and a Camelot which the Cow's Brigade couldn't keep. He grinned, wide and genuine. If anyone ever writes the official history of this, I hope they keep that list exactly as ridiculous as it actually is. Issei looked around at the small, strange, growing group gathered in the ruins of a forgotten temple, 6 people now where there had been one frightened, exiled boy 3 weeks earlier, and felt something steady and warm settle into the place where the fear used to live. They will, he said. Because I'm not planning on letting them forget any of you, not after everything you're choosing to risk standing here. Far to the south, in chambers neither Issei nor any of his new household could see, the old Satan faction's careful patience had not yet given way to alarm. But somewhere in the quiet calculation of Lady Viper's mind, a small, precise note was already being made about a neckish stray's known associates, and the speed with which an outcast's network could, apparently, become something resembling an army. Chapter 12. Reaching Seraphal Leviathan without alerting the old Satan faction's watchers proved to be the most delicate operation Grayfia had ever planned, and she said as much, more than once, in the days leading up to it. She cannot be summoned through any official channel, Grayfia explained, pacing the edge of their current camp with the focused intensity she brought to every piece of strategy. Every formal request to a sitting Satan passes through administrative channels that the old houses have spent centuries quietly infiltrating. If we ask to see her directly, Lord Indra will know within the hour. So how do we reach her? Issei asked. Through her one indulgence the old houses have never managed to fully monitor, Grayfia said, something almost fond touching her voice despite the gravity of the conversation. Seraphal maintains a private retreat in the human world, disguised as an ordinary apartment in Tokyo, where she goes, ostensibly, to enjoy human entertainment media without the formality of her office following her. It is technically beneath official notice. In practice, it is the only place in any world where she can be reached without an audience she did not choose. It took 2 more days of careful, indirect travel to reach the address Grayfia produced from memory, and when Issei finally stood outside the unassuming Tokyo apartment door, flanked by Grayfia and Aquino while Kuroka, Biko, and Le Fay waited at a discreet distance, he found himself, absurdly, more nervous than he had been facing 12 armed exorcists in a forest clearing. Grayfia knocked. There was a long pause, the sound of something being hastily turned off inside, and then the door opened to reveal Seraphal Leviathan in civilian clothes, magical girl wand still, somewhat sheepishly, clutched in one hand, her expression shifting from confused irritation to wide-eyed shock in the space of a single second. Grayfia? Seraphal's eyes flicked past her, taking in Aquino, and then, finally, settling on Issei, on the faint glow that traced the crown he had stopped trying to hide weeks ago. Her entire posture changed, the playful, distracted energy dropping away into something far more alert and far more serious. Oh, she said quietly. Oh, that's not a normal devil signature at all, is it? May we come in? Grayfia asked. What we need to discuss should not be said in the hallway. Seraphal stepped back to let them inside without another word, closing the door behind them and activating, with a quick gesture, a privacy ward that settled over the apartment like a held breath. Talk, she said, all traces of her usual playfulness gone, replaced by the sharp, focused attention of a woman who had clearly been waiting, on some level, for exactly this kind of conversation to eventually arrive at her door. Issei told the story once more, the version that was growing more practiced with each retelling but had lost none of its weight, and Seraphal listened without interrupting, her dark eyes never leaving his face, until he finished. True Lucifer, she said softly, when he was done. The uncorrupted original. Not a corruption, not a foreign power, the actual, literal soul. The entire old Satan faction's legitimacy depends on having ended 10,000 years ago. She let out a long breath, sinking onto the edge of her couch as though the weight of it had finally caught up with her legs. Do you have any idea how long I've suspected something like this was possible? Not you, specifically, obviously. But the shape of the lie. I've sat in council sessions for decades listening to Lord Indra and his allies talk about the old line being extinct with this particular, practiced certainty that always felt less like fact and more like a story everyone had simply agreed to stop questioning. You suspected, Grayfia said? And said nothing? What was I supposed to say? Seraphal's voice had an edge of old frustration in it now, something that had clearly been building for far longer than the last few minutes. I'm one Satan among four, Grayfia. Sirzechs at least has reform momentum behind him. I've spent my entire reign being underestimated specifically because I dress like this and act like this, which, fine, I've made that work for me in plenty of ways, but it also means nobody takes my suspicions seriously unless I bring them proof. I had a feeling. I didn't have a boy standing in my living room with 12 wings and a crown that doesn't come off. She looked up at Issei, something resolving in her expression. I have proof now. What does that mean for you? Issei asked carefully. If you stand with us? Seraphal was quiet for a moment, weighing the question with visible care. It means I become a problem for the old Satan faction in a way I haven't been before, she said finally. Right now they tolerate me because I'm strange and distractible and easy to underestimate. The moment I openly acknowledge the true Lucifer's claim, I stop being the eccentric Satan they can write off and start being the crack in their unified front they can't pretend isn't there. She smiled, small and sharp, something fierce surfacing beneath the playful exterior she usually wore like armor. Good thing I've never minded being underestimated right up until the moment it stops working in their favor. You don't have to decide tonight, Issei said. This is a big risk for you. I don't want you saying yes just because we showed up at your door. I appreciate that, Seraphal said, and meant it, something genuine warming her expression. But I think you should know, Issei Hyoudou, or whatever the history books eventually decide to call you, that I've spent decades watching the new Satan reforms stall out exactly where they started threatening the old house's actual power instead of just their pride. Sirzechs is a good man and a careful king, but careful kings rarely finish the job that needs finishing. Sometimes the system needs something it can't carefully reform its way around. She rose from the couch, crossing to stand before him with the full weight of her office, briefly, visible beneath the civilian clothes and the magical girl wand still loosely held in one hand. I'm not agreeing to follow a boy who wants a throne, Issei. I'm agreeing to stand with someone who might finally force this world to stop lying about what it actually is. That's worth the risk to me. It has been for a long time. I just needed someone to finally make the lie impossible to keep telling. Grayfia inclined her head, something like quiet relief passing across her composed features. Then we have our first sitting Satan. You have your first sitting Satan, Seraphal agreed, and then, the seriousness breaking for just a moment into something closer to her usual energy, added, and also possibly your new favorite person to bring snacks to strategy meetings, because I refuse to plan a revolution on an empty stomach, and from the look of you, Issei, you haven't eaten a proper meal in weeks. Despite everything, despite the gravity of what had just been decided, Issei found himself laughing, and the sound of it, easy and unguarded, felt like the first real relief he'd allowed himself in longer than he could remember. Outside, in the quiet Tokyo night, Kuroka, Biko, and Luffei waited, and somewhere far across the distance between worlds, in a chamber beneath House Indra's ancestral seat, the old houses remained, for now, entirely unaware that the crack Seraphal had just become was no longer a suspicion they could afford to dismiss. Chapter 13. It took the old Satan faction 9 days to learn that Seraphal Leviathan had quietly stopped attending certain closed sessions where her presence had once been reliable, and another 3 to confirm, through a chain of bribed clerks and pressured informants, exactly why the chamber beneath House Indra's seat had grown more crowded since the last meeting in it. Word of a sitting Satan's defection was not the kind of news that stayed contained to 4 chairs. This changes the calculation considerably, Lady Viper said, her composed precision fraying, for the first time any of them could remember, at the edges. We are no longer discussing the quiet removal of an unaffiliated boy with delusions of bloodline. We are discussing a coalition that now includes a sitting member of the Satan Council. That is no longer deniable through proxies and rented exorcists. Then we accelerate, as I said we would if circumstances required it, Lord Agar said, his earlier contempt for the whole situation hardening now into something closer to alarm. We cannot allow this to gather further legitimacy. Every week he remains unaddressed, the wound to our position deepens. Accelerate to what, precisely? Lady Viper's voice had sharpened, cutting through the room with the particular edge of someone whose careful strategy was being threatened by impatience she considered reckless. An open assault now would require us to explain, publicly, why 4 sitting Satans, 3 of whom presumably did not authorize it, suddenly find themselves at war with a boy whose only crime, by any account currently circulating, is existing in a form inconvenient to our position. Sirzechs would have grounds to investigate us directly. We would hand him precisely the justification he has wanted for years to dismantle what remains of our influence entirely. Then what would you have us do? Lord Agar snapped. Wait patiently while he gathers every discontented stray and reform-minded fool in the underworld, until his coalition is too large to dismiss as rumor at all. A new voice entered the conversation, one Issei's allies had not yet learned to fear by name. Lord Crossell, a younger member of the old houses, sharp-featured and ambitious in the particular way that made older devils nervous about exactly how far he was willing to go to prove his usefulness, leaned forward from a seat near the chamber's edge. Perhaps, he said, we have been thinking about this too narrowly. We keep asking how to remove him. We should be asking how to discredit him so thoroughly that removing him becomes unnecessary, because no one credible will be left willing to stand beside him. Lady Viper's eyes turned toward him, assessing. Explain. He has gathered, from what our informants report, a stray Nekasha wanted for killing her own master. A defected Cows Brigade affiliate. A devil cast out for refusing a direct order in wartime. A fallen-blooded girl who abandoned her own peerage. Lord Crossell's mouth curved into something thin and calculating. These are not, by any honest reading, the credentials of a legitimate claimant building a righteous coalition. These are the credentials of a criminal gathering other criminals. We do not need to prove he is dangerous. We simply need to make certain that every story told about him from now on leads with exactly who he has chosen to surround himself with, and lets the listener draw their own conclusions about what that says about him. Lord Indra, who had been silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke, something approving entering his careful, restrained tone. A narrative campaign, he said, rather than a military one. Slower. But considerably harder for him to counter with force, since force is precisely the thing we would be accusing him of representing. Precisely, Lord Crossell said. Let him gather his strays and his criminals and his one eccentric Satan. We will simply make certain that by the time the wider underworld hears his name, they have already heard, repeatedly, exactly what kind of company he keeps, and exactly how much of his coalition was built from people the system rightly cast out. He spread his hands, almost pleasant in his confidence. We are not asking anyone to believe a lie, gentlemen. Every fact I intend to circulate will be entirely true. We are simply choosing which true facts get told first, and in what order, because the first version of a story a frightened public hears is almost always the version they keep. Lady Viper considered this for a long moment, her earlier frustration giving way, slowly, to something more like reluctant respect. It is cleaner than open assault, she admitted. It carries less risk of provoking Sirzechs into open intervention. And it has the advantage of being, as you say, almost entirely true, which makes it considerably harder for the boy to refute without sounding as though he is defending criminals, which will not help his case regardless of how sympathetically he frames it. Then we are agreed, Lord Indra said, rising. Patience remains the strategy. But the patience now serves a narrative campaign rather than simple observation. Lord Crossell, you will oversee the dissemination, carefully, through channels that cannot be traced back to this chamber. Let the underworld decide for itself, with our gentle and entirely truthful guidance, exactly what kind of king a coalition of murderers, traitors, and defectors is likely to make. The chamber began to empty, the careful, hierarchical procession of old houses filing out one at a time, and Lady Viper lingered a moment longer than the rest, watching Lord Crossell with an expression that held, beneath its careful neutrality, something that might have been the first stirring of genuine concern. You are very confident, for someone so young, she said, when the chamber had nearly emptied. I am very useful, for someone so young, Lord Crossell corrected, with a thin smile. There is a difference, Lady Viper, and I intend to make certain everyone in this coalition understands it before this is finished. She studied him a moment longer, something calculating behind her composed expression, and then turned and left without another word, leaving him alone in the chamber with the old portraits and the older silence, already, behind his pleasant, confident smile, turning over exactly how much further this particular usefulness might eventually carry him. Far above, unaware that the nature of the threat against them had just shifted from blades in the dark to whispers in the light, Issei and his small, growing household continued the slow, careful work of building something true, with no way yet to know that the next attack would not come for their bodies at all. It would come for their names. Chapter 14. The rumors reached them first through Serafal, who arrived at their camp 11 days later with none of her usual lightness, a folder of carefully gathered reports tucked under one arm and an expression that told Issei, before she said a single word, that whatever she had brought was not good news. It started, she said, dropping into the small circle around their fire without preamble. Whisper campaigns mostly, the kind that don't have a single traceable source but somehow reach every salon and council chamber in the underworld within the same week. I've heard 3 different versions already, all of them technically true, all of them arranged to sound exactly as damning as possible. Tell me, Issei said. Serafal spread the reports across her knees, her usual playfulness entirely absent. The clean version goes like this. An unstable sacred gear user with delusions of ancient bloodline has assembled a private army of criminals and outcasts, a murderer, a Cow's Brigade defector, a war deserter, a peerage abandoner, and is positioning himself to seize a throne that was settled 10,000 years ago by devils far wiser than he is. One sympathetic Satan, known for eccentric judgment, has unfortunately lent her name to the effort. She looked up, grim. Every word of that is, technically, defensible as fact. They've just arranged the facts to make you sound like exactly the kind of dangerous fraud they need you to be. Aquino's jaw tightened. They're calling Kuroka a murderer without mentioning why she did it. They're calling me a peerage abandoner without saying a single word about what I was abandoning it for. That's the entire strategy, Grayfia said quietly, her composed expression betraying, for once, real anger beneath its careful surface. Lord Crossell, I would guess, given the precision of it. This is not the work of men who simply hate Issei. This is the work of someone who understands narrative the way Lady Viper understands strategy, and is using that understanding with considerable skill. Kuroka, who had gone very still during Serafal's recitation, finally spoke, her voice flat in a way that none of them had heard from her before. They're not wrong that I killed my master, she said. They're just leaving out that he was about to slaughter an entire village of innocents because his orders demanded it, and I refused to let that happen. They know that detail. They've always known it. They just decided it wasn't useful to the story they wanted told. I know, Issei said quietly, reaching over to rest a hand on her shoulder, the gesture careful, grounding. I'm not going to let that be the only version of your story anyone hears, Kuroka. I promise you that. How? Biko asked, not unkindly, but with the blunt practicality that had become his particular contribution to every council since he joined them. We can't exactly call a press conference, Dragon Boy. Half the underworld already thinks we're a criminal gang. The other half hasn't heard of us yet, and at this rate, by the time they do, they'll already believe the worst version before they ever hear ours. Issei sat with that for a long moment, staring into the fire, feeling the old, patient weight inside him turn the problem over with a calm that surprised him even now, weeks into learning to trust that the calm belonged to him as much as the fear did. Then we stopped letting them tell the story first, he said finally. Grayfia's eyes sharpened with interest. Explain. They're winning because they're choosing which true facts come out and in what order, and we're letting them, because we've been hiding in forests trying not to get found. Issei looked around the fire, at Akino's anger, at Kuroka's old grief worn raw again by the unfairness of it, at Grayfia's careful calculation, at Biko's blunt frustration, at Lefei's wide, worried eyes, at Serafal's grim reports. What if we stopped hiding? Not recklessly. Not walking into a trap. But what if the next time someone hears the name Lucifer attached to mine, it's not because Lord Crossell decided what version of the story they get to hear first? What if it's because we told it ourselves, completely, with nothing left out, to someone the Underworld actually has to listen to? You mean Sirzechs, Grayfia said slowly. I mean Sirzechs, and the full Satan Council, and anyone else with enough standing that what they witness becomes harder to quietly bury than a campfire rumor. Issei felt the shape of the idea solidifying as he spoke it, the strategic instinct that had been sleeping inside him for 10,000 years finally surfacing alongside the raw power he'd spent weeks learning to control. We've been treating exposure like the danger. But Lord Crossell just proved that silence is the actual danger, because silence lets them fill in every blank with whatever story serves them best. If we control when and how the truth comes out, completely, on our own terms, with everyone's real story attached instead of the version they cut down to sound worse, we take that weapon away from them entirely. Serafal was nodding slowly, something sharp and approving entering her expression. It's risky, she said. Walking into a full council session means walking into a room with people who might still want you dead. But it also means doing it on a stage they can't quietly control afterward. Witness truth is a lot harder to bury than whispered fiction. I'm not interested in being safe anymore, Issei said, and found that he meant it completely, the fear that had driven him out of Ko weeks ago finally giving way to something steadier, something that felt, for the first time, less like running from what he was and more like deciding, deliberately, what to do with it. I'm interested in making sure that when people finally hear the whole story, they hear all of it. Kuroka's village. Akino's mother. Biko's war. Lefei's family. Grayfia's whole life of loyalty to a question she was never allowed to ask. He looked around at all of them, every face lit by firelight, every one of them having already risked everything once to stand here. If we're going to be called criminals either way, I'd rather it be because we told the truth too loudly for comfort, not because we let someone else's lie go unanswered. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and one by one, around the circle, Issei watched resolve settle into faces that had arrived, each in their own way, carrying old wounds the world had decided weren't worth hearing properly. Okay, Grayfia said finally, something fierce and certain in her voice. Then let us begin building exactly the kind of reckoning Lord Crossell did not anticipate having to survive. Above them, the night sky stretched wide and indifferent, the same sky that had watched 10,000 years of careful, comfortable lies, about to watch, for the first time in all that history, someone choose to answer them not with a blade in the dark, but with the truth, told completely, in the light. Chapter 15. The request reached Sirzechs Lucifer through the single channel Grayfia knew, beyond any doubt, the old houses had never managed to fully infiltrate, a sealed letter delivered directly into his private study by a messenger spirit bound to her own blood, a privilege of their marriage that not even a divided loyalty had revoked. He read it twice before setting it down. Issei Hyoudou requests an audience before the full Satan Council. Not a trial. Not a summons. A hearing, open to witness, in which the truth of his nature and the truth of those who stand with him will be spoken completely, without omission, so that no one may shape it into a weapon afterward by telling only the part that serves them. Sirzechs sat with the letter for a long while in the quiet of his study, the weight of it settling into him slowly, the way truths that have been circling a person for weeks finally do when they stop circling and land. He had heard the whispers, of course. Everyone in any position of consequence had heard them by now, the careful, deniable narrative that Lord Crossell's faction had been seeding through salons and council antechambers for nearly 2 weeks. A story of criminals and outcasts gathering around a delusional boy with a stolen bloodline's name. He had not believed it, Not fully, not the version designed to be believed. But he had also not yet found a way to answer it that did not risk tearing his own fragile coalition apart from the inside, reformers and traditionalists alike unable to agree on how much truth the underworld could survive hearing all at once. Now the boy himself was answering it for him, on terms Sirzechs had not chosen and could not control, and some old, weary part of him recognized, with a strange and complicated relief, that this might be the only path through the situation that did not end in someone he loved being asked to choose a side that cost them everything. He summoned Grayfia that evening, in the private wing of the castle where their conversations had always belonged more to husband and wife than to king and queen. You came to ask him to find safety, Sirzechs said, when she stood before him. Not to stay. I came to ask him to find safety, Grayfia agreed, her composure entirely her own, neither apologetic nor defiant, simply honest. I did not anticipate staying. I did not anticipate, either, that staying would feel less like betrayal and more like finally answering a question I had spent my whole life refusing to ask out loud. She held his gaze steady. I do not regret it, Sirzechs. I want you to hear that clearly, whatever else is said in this room tonight. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, there was no anger in his voice, only a tiredness that had been building for far longer than the last few weeks. I am not certain I would have made a different choice, in your position, he said. That is the part that frightens me most, Grayfia. Not that you left. That I understand entirely why you did. Then help him, Grayfia said. Not because he asks it as a debt owed to me. Because the request he has sent you is the only path I can see that does not end with either an open war the underworld cannot survive, or a silence so complete that the old houses simply finish erasing him the way they erased the truth of his bloodline the first time. Sirzechs rose, crossing to the window that looked out over the spires of a city built, he understood now with a clarity that ached, on a foundation considerably less settled than he had spent his entire reign believing. If I grant this hearing, he said slowly, I cannot guarantee its outcome. The council is not mine alone to command, however much the old houses resent pretending otherwise. There will be members in that room who arrive already determined to see him destroyed, regardless of what truth he brings before them. He knows that, Grayfia said. He is asking for the chance to be heard completely, not the promise of being believed. He understands those are different things, and he is choosing the harder one anyway, because the alternative is letting Lord Crossell finish deciding what story the underworld gets to keep. Something in Sirzechs' expression shifted then, a flicker of the brother who had once, decades ago, fought just as hard against a different inherited story, the one that said a Gremory heir owed her hand in marriage to whatever alliance her family's interests required rather than to her own choosing. He had broken that story for his sister once, at considerable personal cost, because he had believed, fiercely, that the old way of deciding who deserved a voice in their own fate was a way that needed breaking. Convene it, he said finally, quiet but resolute. 3 days from now. Full council, all 4 Satans present, all old houses entitled to attend granted notice, and a seat. If he wants to be heard completely, then let him be heard completely, in a room large enough that no one chamber beneath any single house's seat can quietly decide afterward what was actually said. He turned back to her, something steady and certain settling into his face. And Grayfia. Whatever the council ultimately decides, I want it on record clearly, that the king of this underworld granted the hearing not as a kindness, but because he believed, as a matter of principle, that a claim this significant deserved to be tested in the light rather than buried in the dark. Let history remember that I chose the harder path too, even if I cannot yet promise where it leads. Grayfia inclined her head, something that might, in a woman less composed, have been the beginning of tears gathering unspoken at the corner of her eyes. Thank you, Sirzechs. Don't thank me yet, he said, and for a moment the weight of the crown he wore showed plainly on his face, 10,000 years of inherited story bearing down on a single difficult decision. 3 days from now, I may be the one standing in that room watching everything I built come apart at the seams, because the foundation it was built on was never as solid as I let myself believe. He managed something that was almost a smile, tired and rueful and, beneath all of it, unmistakably brave. But I would rather watch it come apart honestly than keep it standing on a lie I was never brave enough to question. Tell him the council will hear him. Tell him I am, despite everything, hoping he proves himself worth the risk I am about to take on his behalf. Chapter 16. News of the hearing reached their camp the following evening, carried by a quiet messenger spirit that dissolved into mist the moment Grayfia confirmed receipt, and for a long moment afterward, no one around the fire said anything at all. 3 days, Grayfia said finally, folding the confirmation with careful precision. Full council. All 4 Satans. Every old house entitled to attend will be granted notice. She looked up, meeting Issei's eyes. This is exactly what you asked for. I want you to understand fully what that means before we begin preparing. Tell me, Issei said. It means every voice that wants you destroyed will be in that room, with full legal standing to speak against you, and no obligation to be kind about how they do it. Grayfia's tone was gentle but unflinching, the careful honesty of someone who respected him too much to soften a truth he needed to hear plainly. It means Lord Crossell will almost certainly be present, and he has had 2 weeks to prepare a version of events designed specifically to make everything you say sound like exactly the self-serving justification he has already convinced half the underworld to expect from you. And it means that whatever is said in that room, true or false, kind or cruel, will become the version of this story that history remembers, because there will be no quieter venue left afterward to correct it. Aquino, sitting close enough that her shoulder brushed Issei's, said quietly, it also means Kuroka has to stand in a room full of people who already believe she's a murderer, and tell them the truth about her master, in front of devils who might decide that truth doesn't matter regardless of how completely she tells it. Kuroka, across the fire, did not flinch from the statement, though something old and weary passed briefly across her usually unbothered expression. I've told that story exactly once before, to people who mattered, and they decided in advance which parts they wanted to believe, she said. I won't pretend that doesn't scare me a little, doing it again in a room with that much power to decide my fate all over again. Her golden eyes found Issei's, steady despite the admission. But I'd rather risk being disbelieved in a room big enough that the truth has a chance, than keep letting Lord Crossell's whisper campaign decide the story for me by default. At least this way, if they choose to believe the worst of me, they'll be choosing it with the whole truth sitting right in front of them. Same, Biko said, leaning back against the fallen log with his usual blunt ease, though something more serious sat beneath it tonight. I deserted during a war I thought was unjust. I'm not ashamed of that. I'd rather say it loud in a room that has to listen than keep hiding it like it's something to apologize for. Le Fay's voice, when it came, was quieter, more uncertain, the wariness that had softened so much over the past weeks resurfacing now under the weight of what was being asked of her. I don't know if I can stand in a room like that, she admitted. My whole life, the people with that much power over my fate decided I was a liability before they ever asked me a single question about who I actually was. I don't know how to trust that this time will be different. Issei turned to her fully, his expression gentle, the ancient patience inside him settling into something that felt, in this moment, less like the weight of 10,000 years and more like simple, steady kindness. You don't have to come, Le Fay, he said. None of you do. I asked for this hearing because I think it's the only way to stop Lord Crossell from finishing what he started, but I'm not going to make anyone stand in that room who isn't ready to. Your story is yours to tell, or not tell, on your own terms, whatever I decide to do. Le Fay was quiet for a long moment, turning her staff over slowly in her hands, and when she finally looked up, something steadier had settled into her wide, uncertain eyes. I want to come, she said. I'm scared. But I think I'm more scared of always wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed hidden one more time, instead of finally standing where someone has to actually look at me and decide I'm more than the worst story they've already heard. She managed something that was almost a smile. Besides, if Biko's going to stand up there being loud and unapologetic, somebody should probably be there to ward the room in case Lord Crossell tries anything underhanded. That earned a short, surprised laugh from Biko, and even Kuroka's mouth curved despite the gravity of the evening. Grayfia watched the exchange with quiet approval before turning the conversation, gently, toward practicalities. We have 3 days, she said. I would use them carefully. Issei, you will need to speak first and speak plainly, because whatever tone you set will shape how the room receives everything that follows. The rest of us will need to be prepared not merely to defend our own histories, but to anticipate exactly the angles Lord Crossell is likely to attack from, since he has had 2 weeks of advanced preparation, and we will have had 3 days. What about Serafal? Aquino asked. Will she be able to speak for us, or will standing with us in that room cost her more than we're asking her to risk? She has already sent word that she intends to be present and to speak openly, Grayfia said. I suspect she has been waiting a very long time for an opportunity exactly like this one, regardless of the personal cost. I would not waste energy trying to talk her out of it. I tried gently in my own letter back to her. She was, in her own words, considerably more enthusiastic about the risk than I expected. Issei looked around the fire once more, at 6 faces that had each, in their own way, already survived being failed by a world that decided their stories weren't worth hearing completely, and felt the weight of what he was about to ask of all of them settle, fully and soberly, onto his shoulders. I need you to know, he said quietly, that whatever happens in that room 3 days from now, I already think every one of you is worth more than whatever verdict a council full of old houses decides to hand down. That's true regardless of what they conclude. I just want the rest of the underworld to have the chance to see what I already see, instead of only ever hearing what Lord Crossell decided to let them hear first. The fire crackled into the silence that followed, and one by one, around the circle, Issei watched each of them settle into a steadiness that had not been there a few minutes before, the particular calm of people who had chosen, deliberately and together, to walk into the hardest room available to them, not because they were certain of the outcome, but because they had decided, finally, that they were done letting someone else's silence decide the shape of their story for them. Chapter 17. Lord Crossell received word of the hearing within hours of Sirzechs' decision, and unlike the rest of his coalition, who reacted with varying degrees of alarm, he found himself, privately, almost pleased. He's walking directly into the largest stage we could have asked for, he told Lady Viper, the 2 of them alone in a smaller chamber than the one beneath House Indra's seat, a meeting Lord Crossell had specifically requested without the older lords present, a detail Lady Viper noted with the same careful attention she gave to everything. 3 days to prepare a defense, against 2 weeks of narrative groundwork already laid across every salon and council antechamber in the underworld. He thinks transparency is his weapon. He has no idea how easily transparency can be turned into a stage for exactly the verdict we already want. You sound very confident, Lady Viper said, studying him with the same calculating patience she had given him in the chamber beneath House Indra weeks earlier. I would remind you that confidence and accuracy are not the same virtue. I am aware of the difference, Lord Crossell said, unbothered. I simply believe I have positioned us well enough that the distinction won't matter. He spread a series of carefully prepared notes across the table between them, each one annotated in his own precise hand. The council will not be hearing his story in a vacuum, Lady Viper. They will be hearing it after 2 weeks of carefully seeded context, every salon conversation, every quiet aside in a council antechamber, every technically true fact arranged to suggest exactly the conclusion we require. By the time he stands before that council, the room will already be primed to hear his testimony as confirmation rather than revelation. And if his testimony is compelling enough to overcome that priming regardless? Lord Crossell's mouth curved into something thin and confident. Then I have prepared a contingency for that as well. He produced a final, smaller document, sliding it across the table with the careful precision of a man revealing his actual plan only once he was certain of his audience's discretion. Sirzechs has structured this as an open hearing, witnessed on the record. That works in our favor as much as it might work in his, if we are careful about what we introduce into that record. I have arranged for several of Kuroka's surviving former associates, people who knew her master, people with grievances against her that predate any of this, to be present and ready to testify, should the moment call for it. Sympathetic to him, perhaps, but loud, credible, and entirely capable of complicating whatever narrative she offers about that night. Lady Viper read the document slowly, her expression giving away nothing. You intend to attack through the weakest member of his coalition rather than the boy himself. I intend to demonstrate, Lord Crossell corrected, That a coalition built on outcasts and criminals will always have a thread someone can pull, regardless of how sympathetically their individual stories are framed. The boy can be as eloquent as he likes about his own nature. It will not matter if the room spends half the hearing relitigating whether his closest ally is a murderer who escaped justice rather than a woman with a complicated, sympathetic excuse. That is considerably more aggressive than the narrative campaign we discussed, Lady Viper said, something careful entering her tone now. If it is discovered that you arranged for hostile witnesses to be planted in what is meant to be an open, impartial hearing, the damage to our position, should it become known, would be severe. Sirzechs is not a fool. If he suspects manipulation of his own hearing, he will not hesitate to use it against us publicly. It will not be discovered, Lord Crossell said, with the easy confidence of a man who had clearly already considered every angle of that risk. Every witness I have arranged has a genuine, independently verifiable grievance. I have manufactured nothing. I have simply ensured that the people with reason to speak against this coalition know precisely when and where their grievances will finally be given a stage worth using. He folded his hands, satisfied. That is not manipulation, Lady Viper. That is simply ensuring that truth, in all its inconvenient complexity, gets a fair hearing alongside whatever sympathetic version the boy intends to offer. Lady Viper studied him for a long moment, something unreadable working behind her composed expression, before she finally set the document down. You are very skilled at this, she said. I want you to understand that I mean that as an observation, not entirely as a compliment. There is a kind of skill that serves a cause, and a kind that begins, eventually, to serve only itself. I have not yet decided which kind I am watching develop in front of me, Lord Crossell, and I would caution you that I am not the only member of this coalition paying close attention to the answer. Something flickered across Lord Crossell's expression then, brief and quickly suppressed, an irritation he had not intended to let show. I am serving the coalition's interests precisely as instructed, he said. If my methods exceed what older, more cautious minds would have devised on their own, I would consider that an asset rather than a concern. Perhaps, Lady Viper said, rising, gathering the documents with brisk efficiency. Or perhaps you are simply young enough to believe that winning a single hearing is the same as winning the larger question it represents. I have watched coalitions like ours win individual battles through exactly this kind of clever, aggressive maneuvering, only to discover afterward that the maneuvering itself became the story people remembered, long after the original grievance had faded from relevance. She paused at the door, looking back at him with an expression that held, for the first time, something almost like warning. Win your hearing, Lord Crossell. But win it cleanly enough that it does not become, in 3 years' time, the precise example reformers point to when they argue that our entire coalition has always cared more about preserving power than preserving truth. She left without waiting for his response, and Lord Crossell sat alone in the small chamber for a long moment afterward, her warning settling uncomfortably alongside his own carefully prepared confidence, before he gathered his documents and turned his attention back to the considerably more immediate, considerably more satisfying work of finalizing exactly how the hearing would unfold 3 days from now, when an entire council would gather to decide the fate of a boy who had no idea yet precisely how carefully the stage beneath his planned testimony had already been arranged against him. Chapter 18. The Hall of Concord, where the full Satan Council convened for matters too significant for any single house to settle privately, had not hosted a hearing this large in over a century, and it showed in the way the assembled old houses filled every available seat, in the murmur of voices that did not quiet entirely even as the 4 Satans took their places at the chamber's head. Issei stood at the center of the floor, his household arranged in a careful arc behind him, Grayfia at his right hand in a posture that made unmistakably clear, to anyone in the room who had once called her colleague, exactly where her loyalty now stood. Aquino beside her, both wing sets visible without apology for the first time in a setting this formal. Kuroka, golden eyes steady despite the weight of hundreds of watching gazes. Biko and Lefei flanking the group's edges, and Sarah Fall, in her formal Satan regalia rather than her usual playful attire, seated at the council's head with an expression that held none of her characteristic lightness. Sirzechs rose first, his voice carrying easily through the hall's careful acoustics. This hearing is convened at the request of the individual standing before this council, who has asked to be heard completely, on the record, regarding claims that have circulated this underworld for some weeks now in considerably less complete form. His eyes swept the assembled houses, lingering, briefly, on the section where Lord Indra, Lord Agars, and Lady Viper sat together, Lord Crossel positioned just behind them with an expression of careful, patient confidence. I ask every member of this council to extend him the same courtesy any claimant deserves before judgment, a full hearing, before a final word. He gestured, and the floor became Issei's. For a moment, standing in the center of that vast hall, with hundreds of ancient, skeptical eyes fixed on him, Issei felt the old fear rise, sharp and familiar, the same fear that had walked him out of Ko on a midnight street months ago with nowhere to go, and no idea what he'd become. Then he felt, beneath it, the patience that had been sleeping inside him for 10,000 years, and let that patience steady his voice. "My name is Issei Hyoudou," he began. 18 years ago I was born an ordinary human in this world's other half, with no knowledge of anything I'm about to tell you. 2 years ago, I died, and was reincarnated as a devil by Gremory, who saved my life and asked nothing in return but loyalty I was glad to give her. 4 months ago, in a basement beneath Ko Academy, my peerage attempted a modified reincarnation meant to contain a power signature they did not understand, out of love and fear in equal measure, believing it would save my life. He paused, letting the room absorb the admission, refusing to soften it into something more comfortable. It did not save my life. It woke something that had been sleeping inside me since before I was born, something the modified piece tried to bury, and could not hold. I am, by every measure Grayfia Lucifuge has been able to determine, and she has had 4 months to determine it carefully, the dormant, uncorrupted reincarnation of the original Lucifer's soul. The murmur that swept the hall at that was not surprise, exactly. Most present had heard some version of the claim already, through Lord Crossel's carefully arranged channels. It was something closer to the sound of a rumor finally being confirmed aloud, in a room large enough that it could no longer be dismissed as merely a rumor. I did not ask for this, Issei continued, his voice steady despite the weight of the room's attention. I did not seek a throne. I did not manipulate a piece or scheme for a bloodline I did not know I carried. I knelt in that basement, and let people I loved attempt to reincarnate me a second time because I trusted them, and what woke up afterward was not something I chose. It was something I discovered. He let his gaze move slowly across the assembled houses, meeting as many eyes as he could in the time it took to speak. I understand that this claim, if true, unsettles 10,000 years of careful history. I understand that for many of you, accepting it costs something significant, whether that cost is comfort, or legitimacy, or simply the peace of believing a question this large was settled long before any of us were born. I am not asking this council to crown me anything today. I am asking only that you hear, completely, what actually happened, and judge for yourselves whether the story you have been told these past 2 weeks is the whole truth, or only the part someone found useful to tell first. Lord Crossel, seated with careful, patient stillness, allowed himself the smallest flicker of a smile, the expression of a man who believed, entirely, that the next portion of the hearing would unfold exactly as he had arranged it. Sirzechs' voice carried again through the hall. The council will now hear testimony regarding the claimant's character, and the nature of those who have chosen to stand with him, before any judgment is rendered on the larger question of his bloodline. His eyes found Lord Crossel's section of the assembly with a directness that suggested he was not entirely unaware of what had been arranged. I understand certain parties wish to offer testimony regarding one member of this coalition in particular. The council will hear it. But I would remind every voice in this hall that a hearing convened to seek complete truth serves no one if it permits only the truths that are already organized to favor one conclusion. A ripple of tension moved through the section where the old houses sat, Lord Crossel's careful confidence flickering, just slightly, at the directness of the warning. Issei, standing at the center of the floor, felt Kuroka's shoulder brush his as she stepped half a pace forward, unbidden, golden eyes steady despite what was clearly coming. Let them speak, she said quietly, for his ears alone. I told you I'd rather risk this with the whole truth in the room than keep hiding from it. I meant that, dragon boy. Whatever happens next, I'm not afraid of the truth. I'm only afraid of what happens when nobody bothers asking for it. Issei looked at her for a moment, something steady and fierce settling between them, and then turned back to the council, his voice carrying clear and unflinching through the waiting hall. Then let's hear it, he said. All of it. Exactly as it happened, with nothing left out by either side. That's what I came here for. Chapter 19. The witness Lord Crossel's allies produced was an older devil, a stern, hawkish woman who introduced herself as a distant relation of Kuroka's former master, and the hall went very still as she rose to speak. 8 years ago, she began, her voice carrying the practiced weight of someone who had rehearsed this testimony many times in her own head. The stray devil standing in this hall murdered her master, a respected officer of an old and honorable house, in cold blood, in front of witnesses who survive to this day and remember exactly what they saw. Her eyes fixed on Kuroka with open contempt. She fled justice for 8 years. Whatever sympathetic context her allies intend to offer this council today, the fact remains unchanged. She is a murderer, and the boy who calls himself the true Lucifer has chosen, of his own free will, to make her one of his closest companions. I would ask this council to consider carefully what that choice reveals about his judgment, regardless of whatever bloodline he claims. The hall murmured, and Issei felt the old fear flicker through him, not for himself this time, but for Kuroka, standing beside him with her jaw set and her golden eyes steady despite the open hostility aimed directly at her. Sirzechs' voice cut through the murmur. The witness's account will be heard in full, as will the accused. He turned to Kuroka with a formality that held, beneath it, something almost gentle. You are not obligated to respond to testimony in this setting. But if you wish to, the floor is yours. Kuroka stepped forward, and for a moment, standing alone in the open space before the council, she looked smaller than Issei had ever seen her, the easy, predatory confidence she usually wore like a second skin replaced by something rawer, more exposed. She's not lying, Kuroka said, her voice steady despite the visible effort it cost her. I did kill my master. I want this council to hear that plainly, before anything else I say. She paused, gathering herself, and when she continued, her voice had hardened into something fiercer. What she left out, what she has always left out, every time this story gets told, is that my master had received orders to lead a raid on a border village, human and devil mixed, that he believed was harboring rebels. There were no rebels. There were farmers, and children, and elderly people who had never held a weapon in their lives. I know, because I scouted the village myself, on his orders, 3 days before the raid was set to happen. I brought him that report. I told him the village was innocent. He told me my objection was noted, and that the raid would proceed regardless, because an example needed to be made, and the truth of who actually lived there was, in his words, an inconvenient complication to a decision already finalized. Her hands had curled into fists at her sides, old grief and old fury both surfacing at once. I tried every other path first. I petitioned his superiors. I was told the matter was settled and my place was to obey, not to question. On the morning of the raid, with no other option left to stop what was about to happen, I killed him, and I have carried that weight every day since, not because I regret saving that village, but because killing him meant I could never again pretend that obedience and goodness were the same virtue. The hall had gone entirely silent now, the earlier murmur replaced by something heavier, more uncertain. I fled afterward because I knew exactly how this story would be told if I stayed to let it be told for me, Kuroka continued. A stray devil, a murderer, dangerous and unpredictable, exactly the testimony you just heard, with the village I saved conveniently left out because a dead village of farmers and children doesn't generate the same outrage as a murdered officer of an old house. I have spent 8 years being hunted for the crime of refusing to let an entire community die for an order that should never have been given. She looked directly at the witness who had spoken against her, something unflinching in her gaze. I am not asking this council to forgive me for killing a man. I made that choice with my eyes open, and I would make it again, exactly the same way, if it meant that village survived. I am asking only that whatever judgment you render today include the whole truth of what that choice actually cost, and actually prevented, rather than only the half that makes me easiest to condemn. For a long moment, the hall remained silent, the weight of her testimony settling into a room that had arrived, many of its members, already prepared to dismiss her as exactly the criminal Lord Crossel's narrative had painted. Sarah Fall rose from her seat at the council's head, her voice carrying clear and unhesitating through the quiet. I would like the record to reflect that I have independently verified the existence of the village in question, she said, through channels separate from this coalition, prior to this hearing, because I anticipated precisely this line of attack might be attempted, and I wished to know the truth before I was asked to render judgment on it. The village exists. Its survivors exist. Several of them have, in the years since, given testimony, unprompted by anyone in this room, describing a Nekashu who arrived without explanation and prevented what would have been their slaughter. She looked across the hall at Lord Crossel's section with an expression that held no trace of her usual playfulness. I would ask whoever arranged for this particular witness to be present today whether they were equally prepared to arrange for those survivors to testify as well, or whether their search for inconvenient truth stopped precisely at the point it became inconvenient to their own narrative. Lord Crossel's careful composure flickered, visibly, for the first time since the hearing had begun, and across the hall, Issei watched something shift in the assembled houses, the comfortable certainty of 2 weeks' careful narrative beginning, for the first time, to crack under the weight of a truth too complete to easily dismiss. Chapter 20. The hall had not fully settled from Kuroka's testimony when Lord Indra rose, his careful, restrained voice cutting through the lingering murmur with practiced authority. One sympathetic account does not absolve an entire coalition of criminals, he said. I would remind this council that we have not yet heard from the fallen-blooded girl who abandoned her own peerage, nor from the Cow's Brigade defector standing among them, nor have we yet addressed the central, unresolved question of whether a single dormant power signature, however ancient, entitles its bearer to contest the throne 10,000 years settled. His eyes swept the hall, gathering the room's attention back toward the argument he had clearly intended to make regardless of how Kuroka's testimony had landed. Sympathy is not the same as legitimacy, however moving the story. I would ask this council not to mistake one for the other. Aquino stepped forward before anyone could respond, her voice steady despite the visible tension in her shoulders. Then let me address the abandonment directly, she said, since Lord Indra seems eager to have it addressed. She let her wings settle fully into view, both sets, dark feathers and devil membrane existing together without apology in front of the entire assembled council. I am Barakiel's daughter. Half fallen, half devil, raised my entire life being told, gently and not so gently, that the fallen half of my heritage was a liability to be managed, hidden, kept quiet enough that it never embarrassed the devil half that was supposedly the more respectable inheritance. Rias Gremory gave me a home when I had nowhere else to belong, and I loved her for it, and I still do. But I watched her peerage attempt to bury an inconvenient power inside someone I cared about because it frightened them, using exactly the same logic that taught me, my whole life, to bury the inconvenient half of myself for everyone else's comfort. Her eyes swept the hall, fierce and unflinching. I did not abandon my peerage out of disloyalty. I left because I finally understood that an order built on managing inconvenient truths instead of confronting them honestly was an order I could no longer serve without continuing to betray the parts of myself I had spent too many years already betraying. If this council considers that abandonment a character flaw, I would ask you to first examine honestly whether the structure I left has ever once, in 10,000 years, made room for someone to be whole instead of merely convenient. The hall was quieter this time, the weight of her testimony landing differently than open hostility might have, something closer to genuine, uncomfortable reflection rippling through sections of the assembly that had arrived prepared only for easy condemnation. Grayfia rose next unprompted, her formal bearing commanding immediate attention even before she spoke. I would like the council to hear from someone whose loyalty to the existing order cannot be reasonably questioned, she said, before it was, by my own choice, set aside. I served as Sirzechs Lucifer's queen for decades. I enforced the structures of this underworld with a faithfulness I believed, until 4 months ago, was simply correct. I watched, in a basement in Ko, A piece designed by some of our most brilliant minds reach into a boy's soul and attempt to bury a truth because that truth was inconvenient to everything I had spent my life protecting. Her silver eyes moved slowly across the assembled houses, steady and unflinching. I do not say this to excuse myself from whatever judgment this council renders today. I say it because I believe every member of this hall owes it to themselves to ask a harder question than whether this boys' coalition contains people with complicated histories. I would ask you to ask, instead, whether the order you are so determined to protect has ever once, in 10,000 years, been honest enough with itself to deserve the unquestioning loyalty it has always demanded. Lord Agar's rose, his contempt for the proceedings barely restrained now. You speak as though loyalty to order is itself the crime, he said. I would remind the strongest queen that order, however imperfect, is the only thing that has kept this underworld from tearing itself apart across 10,000 years of history considerably more volatile than the comfortable peace we currently enjoy. Sentiment is not governance, however movingly it is delivered in this hall today. I am not arguing against order, Grayfia said, her voice calm but unyielding. I am arguing that an order built, in part, on a deliberately maintained silence about the truth of this boy's bloodline is not the stable foundation you believe it to be. It is simply a lie that has not yet been tested. I watched that lie nearly destroy someone I loved 4 months ago, because the system I served valued the comfortable silence more than the inconvenient truth underneath it. I would ask this council, with genuine respect for the difficulty of what I am asking, to consider whether the order you wish to protect is actually order at all, or whether it is simply a story that has gone unquestioned for so long that questioning it now feels, falsely, like chaos. The hall fell into a heavier silence than any that had preceded it, Lord Agar's response dying unspoken on his lips as something in Grayfia's testimony settled, visibly, into corners of the assembly that had not expected to find themselves genuinely uncertain by this point in the proceedings. Sirzechs, watching from the council's head, allowed the silence to stretch a moment longer before speaking. The council will take a brief recess, he said, before hearing the remaining testimony and proceeding to deliberation. I would ask every member present to use that time honestly, examining not only what has been said today, but what it has cost each speaker to say it aloud, in a room they had every reason to believe would not listen fairly. As the hall began to stir, old houses murmuring among themselves with considerably less certainty than they had carried into the chamber that morning, Issei caught Lord Crossel's eye across the distance, and saw, for just a moment, beneath the man's carefully maintained composure, the first flicker of genuine alarm. The narrative he had spent 2 weeks so carefully constructing was no longer entirely his to control. Chapter 21. During the recess, Lord Crossell did not retreat to consult with his allies, as protocol and prudence both would have suggested. Instead, he moved quickly through the side corridors of the Hall of Concord, finding Lady Viper alone in a small antechamber where she had withdrawn to consider the morning's proceedings in private. It's slipping, he said without preamble, his earlier confidence considerably more frayed than it had been 3 days ago. The hearing is slipping away from the narrative we built. If the afternoon session continues this way, the council will conclude this entire coalition deserves sympathy rather than condemnation, and that is not an outcome our position can survive intact. Lady Viper studied him with the same careful, unreadable patience she had given him in every previous conversation. Then perhaps, she said, the narrative we built was never as solid as you believed it to be, and what is slipping is simply the truth finally catching up to where it always should have been. That is not the response I expected from you. No, she agreed. It is, however, the response I have been considering since I watched Grayfia Lucifuge stand in that hall and dismantle, in under 5 minutes, an argument I have spent considerable effort helping construct over the past several weeks. Something in her composed expression had shifted, subtly, during the morning's testimony, a recalculation occurring behind her careful neutrality that Lord Crossell, in his mounting anxiety, did not appear to fully register. I would ask you to consider, Lord Crossell, whether your remaining options to salvage this afternoon's proceedings are the kind that serve our coalition's legitimate interests, or merely the kind that serve your own determination not to be seen losing a fight you initiated. I have one option remaining that I believe will work, Lord Crossell said, ignoring the warning entirely. his focus narrowing with the particular intensity of a man who had staked too much on a single outcome to consider abandoning it gracefully. The boy's claim rests entirely on Grayfia's assessment of his signature. No independent verification exists beyond her word, however respected that word has historically been. If I can introduce doubt about the signature itself, suggest that what she witnessed might be explained by some other phenomenon entirely, a corrupted sacred gear interaction, a foreign power masquerading as something older, the entire foundation of his claim becomes contestable again, regardless of how sympathetic his coalition's individual stories have proven. And do you possess evidence for any such alternative explanation? Lady Viper asked, or are you proposing to introduce a theory you do not yourself believe, purely to muddy a hearing that is no longer unfolding in our favor? Lord Crossell did not answer immediately, and the silence told her everything she needed to know. I see, she said quietly. I had hoped, Lord Crossell, that my warning 3 days ago would have tempered this impulse rather than simply taught you to conceal it better. She rose, smoothing her robes with brisk, deliberate precision. I will not stop you from attempting whatever gambit you have prepared. You have earned, through your own initiative, the right to attempt it. But I want you to understand clearly that I will not stand beside you in that hall if it fails, and based on what I witnessed this morning, I believe quite strongly that it will. You would abandon the coalition's position at the precise moment it most requires unity? I would abandon a position that has stopped serving the coalition's actual interests, and started serving only your own unwillingness to accept that this particular battle may simply be lost, Lady Viper said, her voice cooling further. There is a difference, Lord Crossell, between defending a cause and defending a wager you have personally made too much of your own standing on to walk away from gracefully. I am increasingly certain which one I am watching you do. She left him alone in the antechamber, and Lord Crossell stood for a long moment in the silence she left behind, the weight of her withdrawal settling uncomfortably alongside his own mounting desperation, before he gathered himself and turned, regardless, toward the hall, his carefully prepared theory of an alternative explanation already forming on his tongue, because whatever doubts Lady Viper's warning had stirred, they were not, he told himself, sufficient to outweigh the cost of simply admitting, in front of the entire assembled underworld, that he had been wrong. When the council reconvened, Lord Crossell rose before any other business could be addressed, his voice pitched with careful, practiced urgency. Before this council proceeds further toward what increasingly appears to be a predetermined conclusion, he said, I would ask that we examine more rigorously the sole piece of evidence underlying this entire proceeding. Grayfia Lucifuge's assessment of the boy's signature rests on a single, decades-old memory of a sealed archive record, recalled and applied under circumstances of considerable emotional intensity. I do not question her sincerity. I question whether sincerity alone is sufficient grounds for a claim of this magnitude, when no independent verification has been offered, and no alternative explanation has been seriously entertained. Sirzechs' expression did not change, though something in his posture had gone very still. What alternative explanation would you propose, Lord Crossell? I do not propose one with certainty, Lord Crossell said, and something in his voice, despite his best effort, carried the thin edge of a man reaching for ground he no longer fully trusted beneath him. I propose only that this council has not adequately ruled one out, and that a claim capable of unmaking 10,000 years of settled history deserves more rigorous scrutiny than a single witness's recollection, however respected. The hall, which had spent the morning session shifting steadily towards sympathy, went quiet in a different register now, uncertain, the careful momentum of the previous hours suddenly, deliberately, disrupted. Grayfia rose to respond, but before she could speak, a new voice entered the hall entirely, calm and unhurried, carrying from the chamber's main entrance with an authority that made every head turn at once. Perhaps, the voice said, an independent verification is precisely what this council requires. I would be glad to offer one, if the council is willing to hear it. Standing in the open doorway of the Hall of Concord, robed in the formal regalia of an office that had not been actively held in centuries, was a figure that made even Sirzechs Lucifer rise fully to his feet in evident, genuine shock. Chapter 22. Archivist, Sirzechs said, and the single word carried a weight that rippled through the entire hall, old houses straightening in their seats, ancient deference surfacing in postures that had grown comfortable, over centuries, with believing the office that word represented had simply ceased to matter. The figure who entered was neither young nor visibly old in any way the assembly could easily place, a slight, unassuming devil whose robes carried the faded, careful insignia of an office so old it predated most of the houses currently seated in judgment. They moved through the hall without hurry, settling into the open space beside Issei with the unbothered calm of someone who had clearly weighed the risk of this entrance long before choosing to make it. "I apologize for the interruption," the archivist said, their voice mild but carrying easily through the hall's careful acoustics. "I have held the office of Keeper of the Sealed Record for longer than most of you have been alive, a position created precisely so that this underworld's most dangerous truths might be preserved honestly, even when preserving them honestly proved inconvenient to whoever held power at the time." Their eyes moved, slow and deliberate, across the assembled houses. "I have listened to this hearing from the gallery since this morning. I had not intended to speak. I find, however, that I can no longer in good conscience allow a claim this significant to be decided on the strength of one witness's memory, when the actual sealed record exists, fully intact, in the very archive my office was created to protect." Lord Crossel's composure, already badly frayed, cracked further. "The sealed archive's contents are restricted," he said, sharp with mounting alarm. "Restricted precisely because their disclosure carries consequences this council has never formally authorized. The archive's contents are restricted from casual access," the archivist corrected, mild and unhurried. "They have never been restricted from disclosure in a formal hearing convened specifically to determine a claim the archive itself bears directly upon. That restriction exists to prevent misuse, Lord Crossell, not to prevent truth from surfacing precisely when truth is what a hearing exists to find." They produced, from within their robes, a small, sealed case, ancient and carefully warded, and set it upon the floor before the council with a reverence that made clear exactly how long it had been since this particular seal had last been broken in public. "I have brought the original record of the Civil War's final hours. Not a summary. Not an official account written afterward by the victors, as so much of our history unfortunately is. The original, unaltered testimony of the devils who witnessed the true Lucifer line's final hours, sealed the same week the war ended, before any house had the chance to shape the story into whatever version best served their position afterward." The hall had gone utterly silent, the weight of 10,000 years of carefully maintained certainty hanging, suddenly and visibly, by a thread. "Break the seal," Sirzechs said quietly. "Let the council hear it in full." The archivist did, the ancient wards dissolving with a soft, resonant chime, and from within the case rose a recorded testimony, preserved through magic far older than anything most of the assembled houses had ever directly witnessed, the voice of a devil dead for 10,000 years speaking once more into a hall that had spent that entire span of time believing his account had been lost. The testimony was brief, and devastating in its simplicity. It described not a Lucifer destroyed in battle, as the official history had always claimed, but a Lucifer who, in the war's final hours, recognizing that his own faction's victory would cost the underworld more than the cause was worth, had chosen to set down his power and his claim voluntarily, sealing the uncorrupted core of his own soul into a dormant state rather than allow that power to be weaponized further in a conflict he had come to believe was unwinnable without unforgivable cost. The official story of his death in battle, the testimony made clear, had been constructed afterward, deliberately, by the surviving houses who found a martyred Lucifer considerably more useful to their new order than a living one who might, someday, choose to return and contest the throne they intended to redefine in his supposed absence. When the recording finished, the hall remained silent for a long, suspended moment, the weight of 10,000 years of foundational history settling, all at once, into something considerably less solid than it had been an hour before. "The signature Grayfia Lucifuge identified," the archivist said quietly, "into that silence, is consistent, in every particular this sealed record describes, with the dormant soul sealing this testimony documents. I have spent decades of my office's tenure cross-referencing exactly this possibility, should it ever arise, because I believed, as keeper of this record, that I owed this underworld an honest accounting whenever the question finally surfaced." They turned to face the full council directly. "I cannot tell you with certainty that the boy standing before you is that soul returned. I can tell you, with the full authority of the office I hold, that the claim is not the delusion or the deliberate fraud certain parties in this hall have spent 2 weeks suggesting it must be. The original Lucifer did not die in the war. He chose, deliberately, to set his power down rather than let it be weaponized beyond what conscience could bear. If that soul has now woken, after 10,000 years of dormancy, I would suggest this council consider very carefully what kind of inheritance it is actually examining today. Issei stood very still in the center of the hall, the weight of that testimony settling into him with a clarity that felt, for the first time since the basement in Co., less like an accident he had survived and more like an answer to a question he had been carrying, unknowingly, his entire life. Lord Crossell, standing alone now in a hall that had turned, decisively and irrevocably, away from everything he had spent 2 weeks so carefully constructing, said nothing at all. His earlier confidence dissolved entirely into the same silence that had swallowed every other voice in the chamber. Chapter 23. It was Lady Viper who broke the silence first, rising from her seat among the old houses with a deliberateness that drew every eye in the hall, including, Issei noted, Lord Crossell's, who watched her rise with an expression caught somewhere between desperate hope and dawning understanding that whatever she said next would not be the rescue he needed. I have spent this entire hearing, she said, engaged in a strategy one helped design, intended to discredit a claim I privately suspected, even before today, might prove uncomfortably true. Her voice was steady, formal, but something beneath it had shifted from the careful calculation she had carried into the chamber that morning. I will not insult this council by pretending otherwise now that the archivist's testimony has made pretending impossible. I built my position in this coalition on the belief that order, however imperfect, was worth protecting even at the cost of some buried truths. I find, having heard what this hall has heard today, that I am no longer certain the order I have spent my life protecting deserves to survive in its current form, built as it apparently was on a martyrdom that was never actually requested by the man it was constructed around. She turned to face Issei directly, something that might, in a woman less composed, have been the beginning of genuine respect. I do not know what you intend to do with this inheritance, Issei Hyoudou. I do not know whether you intend to claim a throne, or simply to exist, finally, without the weight of a lie pressing down on the truth of what you are. But I find that I am no longer willing to stand among those determined to bury that truth a second time, having watched what the first burial nearly cost you, and what today's hearing has cost everyone brave enough to stand and tell their whole story rather than the convenient half. She inclined her head, formal even now, and stepped back from the section where Lord Indra and Lord Agar sat in stunned, furious silence. I withdraw my support from this coalition's narrative campaign, effective immediately. I will not pretend a verdict I no longer believe in, merely because abandoning it costs me standing among houses I have served for centuries. Lord Indra rose, his careful restraint finally cracking into something closer to open alarm. You would abandon 10,000 years of settled order on the strength of a single archived testimony and a council hearing's emotional momentum? I would abandon a lie, Lady Viper said simply, on the strength of evidence I have no honest grounds left to dismiss. That is not the same accusation you are attempting to level at me, Lord Indra, and I would ask you to consider, carefully, whether your continued resistance to this evidence is principled, or whether it is simply the particular fear of men who have built their entire legitimacy on a foundation they are only now discovering was never as solid as they needed it to be. The hall had shifted entirely now, the careful, skeptical hostility of the morning session replaced by something far more uncertain, old houses murmuring among themselves with the particular unease of an entire society watching its foundational story crack open in real time. Sirzechs rose, his voice carrying the full weight of his office now, steady and resolute despite everything the hearing had unsettled. This council has heard testimony, evidence, and independent verification regarding the claim before it, he said. I do not believe a single hearing, however thorough, is sufficient to determine every consequence of what has been revealed today. The question of what this means for our governance, our history, and our future cannot be settled in an afternoon, however much certain parties might wish it could be. His eyes found Issei's, steady and grave. But I believe this council can, today, settle one matter clearly. The claim that Issei Hyoudou is a fraud, a delusional pretender exploiting a corrupted sacred gear, has not survived this hearing's scrutiny. The archivist's testimony, combined with Grayfia Lucifuge's independent assessment and the character demonstrated by every member of his coalition who stood in this hall today, establishes, beyond reasonable doubt, that his claim deserves to be taken seriously, investigated further, and addressed honestly, rather than dismissed through whisper campaigns and planted testimony designed to discredit before any honest hearing could occur. He turned to address the full assembly. I am formally recognizing Issei Hyoudu's claim as legitimate and worthy of continued investigation by this council. I am not, today, recognizing any specific claim to governance or succession, a matter this hearing was never convened to settle and one I believe requires considerably more careful deliberation than a single afternoon allows. But I will not permit this underworld to continue treating the question as settled simply because settling it honestly proves inconvenient to those who built their position on its remaining closed. Lord Agar's rose, his fury barely restrained, though something in his posture suggested even he understood the ground beneath his position had shifted too far to recover in this particular room, on this particular day. This council has not heard the last of this, he said. A single hearing does not unmake 10,000 years of governance, whatever sympathy this hall has been maneuvered into feeling today. No, Sirzechs agreed. It does not. But it has, I believe, made clear that the silence which once protected that governance from this exact question is no longer available to you, Lord Agars, regardless of what you choose to do with the truth that has finally surfaced. His gaze swept the hall one final time, settling, briefly, on Issei with something that was not quite fatherly and not quite kingly, but held elements of both. This hearing is concluded. What follows from it, I suspect, will take considerably longer than a single afternoon to fully resolve. As the hall began to empty, old houses filing out in clusters of uncertain, murmuring conversation, Issei felt Akino's hand find his, and Kuroka's shoulder brush against his other side, and Grayfia stepped close behind him with the quiet, steady presence of someone who had risked everything on this single afternoon and found, against considerable odds, that the risk had been worth taking. We didn't win everything, he said quietly, watching Lord Agars and the remnants of the old Satan faction's most committed members withdraw from the hall with expressions that promised, unmistakably, this was not the end of their resistance. No, Grayfia agreed. But we won the only thing that actually mattered today. The lie is no longer the only story available to be believed. She looked at him with something that might, in a woman less composed, have been quiet pride. Everything that follows from here, Issei, will be harder in different ways. But it will be harder honestly, in the light, rather than buried in a silence designed to erase you before anyone had the chance to truly see what you actually are. Across the emptying hall, Lord Crossell remained seated for a long moment after nearly everyone else had gone, staring at the place where the archivist's case still rested, sealed once more, on the chamber floor, and something in his expression, beneath the wreckage of his careful, ambitious confidence, had already begun, quietly, to calculate exactly how much further he was willing to fall before he finally decided this particular fight was no longer worth the cost of continuing it. Chapter 24. They found Rias waiting outside the Hall of Concord, alone, in the quiet courtyard where afternoon light fell long and gold across ancient stone, and Issei's steps slowed at the sight of her, the weight of everything left unresolved between them rising up all at once. She looked different than she had 4 months ago. Older somehow, though the change was not in her face so much as in the way she carried herself, a steadiness that had not been there the night the basement cracked open beneath them both. I heard everything, she said, before he could speak. I was in the gallery. I didn't want you to see me there, not until I'd decided what I actually wanted to say. And what do you want to say? Issei asked, careful, uncertain, the old grief of that night rising alongside something gentler that had never quite left him either. That I was wrong, Rias said simply, and the admission cost her visibly, the words coming slow and deliberate. Not about loving you. I don't think I'll ever be wrong about that, however complicated it's become. But wrong about believing that protecting you meant deciding, on your behalf, what parts of yourself were safe enough to let exist. She looked down at her own hands, twisting together in a gesture Issei recognized from countless quieter moments, back when their biggest worry had been exam schedules and clubroom budgets. I've had 4 months to think about that basement, Issei. I keep coming back to the same conclusion. I was so afraid of losing you that I never stopped to ask whether the thing I was trying to save was actually you, or just the version of you I'd already decided I needed to protect. I don't blame you, Issei said quietly, and found, saying it, that he meant it more fully than he had on the night he first said it. I never did, not really. I was angry, and scared, and I still am, some days. But I understood, even then, that you weren't trying to hurt me. That doesn't make it not a betrayal, Ria said, with a directness that surprised him. I'd rather you let it be one, Issei, honestly, than let me off easily because it's more comfortable for both of us. I betrayed your trust trying to protect you. Those two things can both be true at once. I think I needed 4 months and an entire council hearing to finally understand that. Behind him, Issei felt his household settle into a careful, respectful quiet, Akino's hand still loosely in his, Grayfia and Kuroka watching the exchange without intruding on it. What happens now? Issei asked. Between us, I mean. Not the underworld. Not the throne. Just us. Rias considered the question for a long moment, her eyes finding his with something that held grief and hope in equal, careful measure. I don't know, she admitted. I'm not asking to be part of your coalition, Issei. I don't think I've earned that yet, and I'm not sure rushing toward it would be honest for either of us. But I'd like the chance to earn something, eventually. Not your loyalty. Just your trust enough to be in the same room without it costing you something to be there. I'd like that too, Issei said, and felt something in his chest, some old, unresolved ache, settled just slightly towards something more bearable. A smaller, familiar shape detached itself from the shadow of the courtyard's far wall, and Issei turned to find Kaneko standing there, arms crossed, ears and tail flickering into visibility the way they did when her composure was fraying at the edges. Senpai, she said, and the honorific carried 4 months of complicated, unresolved feeling in a single word. I watched too. From the gallery, with Bucho, Kaneko. Issei crossed the courtyard slowly, careful, giving her room to step back if she needed it. She didn't. I'm sorry I left the way I did. You're not sorry you left, Kaneko said, with the same blunt honesty she'd always carried, even now, even here. You're sorry it hurt. Those aren't the same thing, and I don't need you to pretend they are. She looked up at him, something fierce and young and entirely sincere in her expression. I miss you. That's all. I'm not ready to be part of whatever you're building. But I miss you, and I wanted you to know that, before you left this courtyard and went back to becoming whatever you're about to become. Issei knelt, bringing himself level with her, the ancient patience inside him giving way, fully, to something simpler and more human. I missed you too, he said. Every single day. That's not going to stop just because today went the way it did. Kaneko didn't say anything else. She simply stepped forward and hugged him, brief and fierce, before pulling back and retreating toward Rias' side, her composure visibly reassembling itself with each step. Rias watched the exchange with something gentle in her expression, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a quiet resolve that Issei recognized, distantly, as the beginning of her own long, complicated road toward whatever came next. Go, she said. Build whatever this is becoming. I'll be watching, Issei, from whatever distance feels right for both of us. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, the door isn't closed. I just won't be the one asking you to walk back through it before you're certain you want to. Issei nodded, the weight of the moment settling into something he could carry rather than something that crushed him, and turned, finally, back toward his household, waiting patiently in the courtyard's gathering evening light. Where to now? Akino asked quietly, falling into step beside him as they left the Hall of Concord behind. Forward, Issei said, looking out over a city built on a story that had, today, finally begun to crack open into something more honest. The hearing bought us legitimacy. It didn't buy us safety. Lord Agars and whatever's left of his faction aren't going to accept this quietly, and we both know it. He glanced back, once, at the courtyard where Rias and Kaneko still stood, watching him go. But for the first time since that basement in Ko, I think we're not just running anymore. I think we're actually building something worth the fight that's still coming. Grayfia fell into step on his other side, her composed expression carrying, for the first time in months, something that looked almost like quiet hope. Then let us begin building it properly, she said, before Lord Agar's decides patience has run out entirely, and chooses a path considerably less civil than the one we walked today. Behind them, the Hall of Concord stood quiet in the fading light, the weight of 10,000 years of settled history no longer quite so settled, and somewhere beneath House Indra's ancestral seat, in a chamber built for conversations no one was meant to repeat, the surviving remnant of the old Satan faction had already begun, in low and furious voices, planning exactly how far they were willing to go now that whispers and proxies had both, in a single afternoon, decisively failed them.